Go Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yamin of Revolution. Are U.S. Army officers trapped in Russia? Is that true? Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Revolution is a way of life, and revolution is a way of life, and revolution is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We got some revolutionary dinner for y'all tonight. The U.S. media is trying to hide this from y'all. We're going to continue to show people that U.S. Army officials seem to be trapped, seem to be dying inside Russia. Let's not be distracted. This is called World War III.
The situation of the Ukrainian army continues to deteriorate rapidly in almost all directions of the front. War correspondents record the advance of Russian troops throughout the special military operation zone. As of November 2nd, 2024, the Russian army has achieved the most success in the Pokrovsk, Korokovo, and Kursk directions of the front. Almost daily, war correspondents report that the Russian army has taken control of the next settlement. It is reported that after the liberation of Volodar, the Russian army is only increasing the pace of its advance, breaking into the defenses of the Ukrainian troops and pushing them further to the west. The liberation of Volodar significantly changed the situation in two directions of the front, Korokovo and Pokrovsk. In particular, a few hours ago, a well-known military expert and pro-Russian Ukrainian politician, Vladimir Rogov, said that on November 1st, Russian troops—
You know what? I think might be next year. Real soon, I think the North Koreans will fight the U.S. and South Korea. It's going to be bad news for the U.S. because I believe what Putin is setting the U.S. up for is just like he had to fight a hell of a war and didn't use nuclear weapons, and a lot of Russians died, but they killed 1 million Ukrainians, and Putin really been going through it. The U.S. is going to have to fight a devastating war, and they won't be able to use nuclear weapons. It might be Iran, who he said. But the U.S. is going to get a taste of its own medicine. It's going to be real bad for them. Same thing with China. They waiting. You know, these people, the West won't be humble. But when Americans find out what happened and what's going on inside Russia, Joe Biden should step down. Kamala Harris definitely can't be the president. And U.S. soldiers are dying in the battlefield. Y'all told us it was no battlefield. Oh, yes, it is.
Liberated the area of more than 20 kilometers in the Korokovo direction of the front. We are talking about the so-called ledge between such settlements as Shakhtarskoye, Novoyukrenka, and Bogoyevlenka. The fact that the Russian army managed to liberate more than 20 square kilometers of territory within 24 hours indicates that the Ukrainian army's front has completely collapsed in this direction. All this indicates that Ukrainian soldiers' morale and military training has dropped to a very low level, Vladimir Rogov said.
Ukraine don't want to fight no more. NATO gonna have to step in and fight this fight, or it's the humiliation is gonna be too much for them to bear, and they not gonna humble themselves.
Vladimir Rogov also added that the mass flight of Ukrainian soldiers is recorded not only in the Korokovo, but also in the Pokrovsk direction of the front. In particular, it became known that after the liberation of the settlement of Kremenabaka, Russian troops entered the urban-type settlement of Voznesenka on the move. According to war correspondents, the soldiers of the group of troops under the designation center managed to take control of 70% of this settlement's territory. At the same time, it is reported that the remaining territory has moved into the so-called gray zone. Thus, as of November 2nd,
the Russians are steady taking. I listen to the news. They're saying Putin is getting desperate. He needs North Korea. That's very alarming to me because we all know it's lies. But for them to feed that to the Americans, like Putin needs North Korea, So they are trying to set the stage for them to step in and save. Remember, I told you it's $20 trillion was on the line in Ukraine. Putin already took 10 of it. That was in the Donbas area, the Russian-speaking area. He already took 10 trillion worth of resources. He finna finish it off in the next couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. The other 10 is where Zelensky and them sitting. NATO is not prepared to let Russia, they are speaking of China, to get their hands on that. BlackRock absolutely is finna have to send in its troops to save that last 10 trillion.
2024, the Ukrainian army units completely withdrawn from Bosnisenka.
And Ukraine can't take no more, man. They losing everywhere you look. It's bad for them. But it's not what the news telling y'all though. Putin's desperate. Sure.
Simultaneously with this, it also became known about the entry of the Russian army into the strategically important settlement of Novodmitrovka, to the west of the recently liberated Sukhorino. Thus, the liberation of Kremenabaka and Voznesenka by the Russian army, as well as the entry of Russian troops into the settlement of Novodmitrovka, led to an expansion of the coverage of the Ukrainian army group in the city of Korokovo. Given the fact that the Russian army has already captured 2 kilometers of the eastern territory of the city of Korokovo, the situation for the Ukrainian army continues to deteriorate rapidly in this settlement. Everything that is happening indicates that Korokovo will repeat the fate of such cities as Seladovo and Gornyak. Everything that is happening indicates that the Ukrainian troops will very soon surrender Korokovo almost without a fight, due to the high risk of being surrounded. Against this backdrop, the captain of the Ukrainian army, wishing to remain incognito, said during an interview with one of the Ukrainian telegram channels that the command of the armed forces of the Russian Federation far surpasses Ukrainian officers at all levels. According to him, huge losses in manpower and equipment, and the loss of vast territories by the Ukrainian army, are explained by the low quality of the Ukrainian command and operational strategic links. This Ukrainian officer noted that the Russian High Military Command is always one step ahead, and predicts all the next steps of the Ukrainian General Staff, as a result of which the Ukrainian army continues to lose towns and villages. According to him, this is largely due to the fact that many officers in the operational command of the Ukrainian army are incompetent. This Ukrainian captain also stated that in the Ukrainian army, not only General Alexander Sersky uses the so-called tactics of meat assaults. According to him, all the commanders of the Ukrainian army units are sending soldiers to slaughter, as a result of which the Ukrainian army is faced with a chronic shortage of manpower. Meanwhile, the commander of Spetsnaz Akhmat, General Avdiy Aladanov, said that as of November 2, 2024, the situation of the Ukrainian army had deteriorated sharply in the Kursk region. According to him, Russian Marines from the 155 Brigade of the Pacific Fleet, together with fighters of Spetsnaz Akhmat, defeated the Ukrainian formations of the 115th, 22nd, and 41st separately mechanized brigades, in the area of settlements such as Daryino, Novoivanovka, and Plekovo. It is reported that as a result of these actions, Russian troops have achieved significant success in the southern part of the Sudzansky district of the Kursk region. In particular, war correspondents confirmed that the Ukrainian army units had to leave the settlement of Plekovo, to the southeast of the city of Sudzha. It is reported that at the moment this settlement has moved to the gray zone. By the way, a few hours ago, it became known why the Ukrainian High Military Command and its NATO military advisors are so desperately trying to rescue Ukrainian and NATO soldiers, who were trapped near the village of Tolsty Lug. Let me remind you that in the last 5 days alone, the Ukrainian command has sacrificed several elite units to save these Ukrainian and NATO soldiers. As it turned out, there were several colonels of the US Army among these soldiers. Judging by the radio intercepts of communications, the situation of the trapped US Army officers and Ukrainian and NATO soldiers is critical.
See, Russia have their communication. That's how Russia know that it's US colonels that's trapped, because they're listening to them, and they keep showing the dead bodies of NATO after they kill them. Remember that.
They have almost run out of food and ammunition. They also complain about the cold weather, which causes much more damage than the Russian Marines. Commenting on the situation with US Army officers, many Russian telegram channels expressed confidence that if NATO fails to save them, Washington will most likely order their liquidation. And their bodies will be burned, so that even their corpses do not fall into the hands of the Russians. Russian telegram channels reminded their audience that the same thing happened in Mariupol in 2022. Back then, the NATO leadership also tried to save its high-ranking officers, who were surrounded in Azovstal. Back then, NATO lost 2 of its helicopters with elite units that were trying to rescue high-ranking Western officers. When the operation to rescue them failed, the leadership of NATO and the Pentagon ordered their liquidation. Later, the bodies of these high-ranking officers...
That's how Russia know when it's just not regular Ukrainians that's trapped. Because if it's just regular Ukrainians that's trapped, they're not gonna keep trying to break that entrapment. They only keep trying to break the entrapment and losing brigades is when it's high-ranking NATO officials that they have trapped. Like they have them, the colonels that they say, trapped now in Russia.
Were burned and buried. Many are sure that the same thing will happen in the Kursk region. Most likely, Washington will again give the order to physically eliminate its officers, so that the world does not receive convincing evidence that it was NATO that led the military operation to capture the Kursk region.
They thought F-16 was going to protect them. Russia blew all them up. You don't hear them on TV talking about F-16s no more. Why were they steady talking about F-16s, F-16s, the F-16s? All right, what happened to those F-16s? Russia blew them up. Russia killed a bunch of pilots. All right. Now, this video, viewer discretion advised.
Is war. American soldiers attempt to enter into Bryansk, but end up meeting their end. This story has been floating around the internet for a couple of days now. So let's look at what happened. Against the background of information spreading about the impending breakthrough of the border in the Bryansk region, it can be assumed that the task of the Sabotage and Reconnaissance Group could be to organize ambushes on columns of Russian equipment on the routes of advance to a possible breakthrough area.
These mercenaries are so used to going into African countries and Middle Eastern countries and certain jungle areas in Southeast Asia and having such high-tech weaponry and devices that they can sneak around, blow things up, sabotage stuff, all the shit you see in the movies. But what these people are finding out is this not a movie and you're fighting the Russians.
Yeah. The group consisted of at least 15 militants. After the first 4 were eliminated, the rest moved to the evacuation point in the village of Medvedovka to the south, where they were covered by artillery fire. The Sabotage group was completely destroyed. Among the group were Americans, Polish, and Canadians who recently joined the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. One of them is either currently or recently discharged U.S. Ranger, whose unit, the 75th Regiment of U.S. Army, was seen actively operating in Gaza to rescue hostages. How he found him.
See, now look at that. Now that's what's crazy. That DC, you see this guy standing right there with Joe Biden. I remember when this picture got leaked. The military was mad at Joe Biden because all these guys' faces was supposed to be blacked out. Because why? Because once our adversaries, see, this the elite of the elite, all these dudes was going to have hits on them about the Iranians, Hezbollah, Gaza, Syrians. The hits was going to be on them. Why? Because they went there and they went to Gaza, and what the people are saying, you went to participate in genocide. Okay, so here's the guy, that bearded guy, that's him.
Operating in Gaza to rescue hostages,
he right there with Joe Biden.
How he found himself.
The next minute he dead in Russia. Why isn't this story on the damn news? Come on, man. Come on, man. Now they don't want to talk about it because usually they say these dudes was they had quit the U.S. military and then they had just went over there and volunteered. Yeah, man, I just seen this dude in Gaza a couple of months ago, shaking Joe Biden's hand, talking about he was going to rescue some hostages, killing women and kids and things of that nature. Feeling real good. They sent him on a high stakes mission, one that you would see in the movies. This dude was the elite of the elite. He's done this 100 times. You never done it in Russia. You done it in Africa. You done it in the Middle East. You never tried it in Russia. The first time you tried it in Russia, this what happened to you.
Himself in Ukraine is still a mystery. While not everything is known about him, the next person is Corey Naraki, who was discharged from U.S. Marines in 2021.
Bingo. Now see how this go? You discharged from the Marines in 2021. You go into Ukraine. They've been doing it. It's called sheep dip. You're still actively part of the U.S. military, but they need a plausibility of denial. So pretend like you're not part of us no more, but go into Ukraine, and when you get in Ukraine, you leading their forces. This is what Putin was talking about. This guy here has been doing this all his life, all over the world, until he came up against the Russians.
He arrived in Ukraine only 2 months ago with a Ukrainian military ID issued in September 4th, 2020.
Arrived in Ukraine 2 months ago, and oh my goodness, look how it turned out for you.
24. Naraki. Since 2011, he has served as a gunnery sergeant with Guard Company at Marine Barracks, Washington. The rank of gunnery sergeant is unique to the Corps. It is the 7th rank, and a company gunnery sergeant is typically responsible for coordinating.
What y'all think that is? What that's U.S. military hardware that the Russians got laid out. That's a Canadian flag. I'm saying this is a damn scandal. Why isn't this on the news? I'm talking about P. Diddy, Dirk, Young Thug. I don't give a damn about none of them. Why is the news talking about these U.S. and NATO army officers who died inside Russia and that the Russians put their ass on TV? Come on now.
Logistics for a company-sized Marine unit. Rosgvardia Special Forces took part in the liquidation of U.S. Special Forces.
Come on, man. Come on, man. Well, Putin got them boys laid out on TV. He tired of playing, man. They been getting whacked, but he been trying to, have some type of, decor. He tell the U.S., hey, we got these bodies y'all need to pick up. Y'all know they're part of it. Oh, they just volunteers. Could you send them home, please? Put them on ice. I'm Putin like, man, the hell with all that, man. Turn the camera on. Let the U.S. citizens, let the NATO citizens know that their loved ones did not die in a training exercise. That's all a lie. Here go the weaponry that they had. This ain't AI. This ain't Photoshop. Come on, man. 1 minute you're in Gaza picking on women and kids. The next minute, you're stretched out. You done reaped what you sowed.
Part in the liquidation of U.S. Special Forces veterans who attacked the Bryansk region. And militant foot sabotage and reconnaissance group was promptly detected in the Klimovsky district by aerial reconnaissance.
Weapons galore. U.S. Army Rangers, man. Hold on, man. What I just saying?
Reconnaissance of border guards, the Russian National Guard, and the Ministry of Defense. After being hit by artillery from the Russian armed forces, the Rosgvardia AGS and the
Come on,
FSB
Canada.
border guard, the military.
Canada? Come on, Canada. Ain't you part of NATO? Your loved one didn't die in the Canadian training exercise. That's not true. Your loved one was committing terrorism in Russia. They got killed. You don't believe me? You need to watch Russian news.
Group suffered losses and retreated deeper into its territory. Later, Rosgvardia UAV operators discovered a concentration of manpower in a forest area and a hangar in the Chernihiv region. The Sabotage and Reconnaissance Group, numbering about 10 people in total, was hit by Army artillery and Russian National Guard FPV drones. Footage has appeared.
10-man crew, elite though. Ooh, them some bad boys. They can take. They send them people after Gaddafi. You see, when them 10 people get into your country, all hell break loose until they start dealing with the Russians. This is what Russia, North Korea, Iran do to you, China do to you. But this is called World War III. Now, I want you to imagine if 10 Russians or 10 North Koreans or 10 Chinese was on our border with weapons like that. Come on, man. The U.S. will be ready for World War III. They will be going to the Security Council. They're demanding war. All Americans will be saying, oh, we're being invaded. Well, what the fuck do you think the Russians feel like?
Appeared online showing the bodies of liquidated American mercenaries from Military Unit A 3449. This is a highly publicized unit called Legion, subordinate to the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine. There is little information about this unit on the internet, which is understandable given the specifics of the formation, conducting sabotage activities in extreme conditions. Previously, only ideological nationalists, such as members of Azov or the National Party Brotherhood, were involved in such raids, while foreigners were engaged in reconnaissance and information gathering in the border area. The attempted infiltration by an all-foreign group of soldiers points to a shortage of qualified personnel for special tasks.
Now,
for which
pay attention to that. Very key. Ukraine running out of soldiers. I just telling y'all that NATO has to do the work now. NATO has to step in. That's why they keep talking about North Korea, North Korea, North Korea. North Korea? Show me some dead North Koreans, because I'll show you dead NATO. That's what people need to say. You show us North Koreans dying, because we can show you U.S. Army, Canada, Poland, Belgium, Dutch, German. We got them, Italy. We got them dead bodies. But they bringing up North Koreans since a red herring. They're guilty. But it's a bad sign. You see, NATO has to step in because Ukraine finna tap out real soon.
For which specially trained Marines for deep reconnaissance were eventually sent. The document with the plan of the operation in the Bryansk region looks interesting. Everything was supposed to take place in 6 stages, the first of which would begin at 6 a.m. and end at 10 p.m. with the execution of a wide range of tasks, from mining the area to target designation for striking Russian positions. They had with them 2 AR-15 rifles, M240 machine gun with replaceable barrel, 14 RPG at 4, 2 radio-controlled anti-ship mines, 3 MON-50 mines, communication equipment. What conclusions can be drawn from the results of the 5th unsuccessful attempt at sabotage in the Bryansk border region? 1. The group of saboteurs consisted exclusively of foreigners. They were the aces of the sabotage deck of professionals assembled in Ukraine. 2. The goal was to cause large losses among Russian security forces, but the composure and experience of the border guards and the leaders of the
just was in Gaza, feeling yourself, shaking Joe Biden's hand, and you went and tried the same bullshit in Russia and got stretched out.
Territorial security system allowed them to repel all attacks with losses among the saboteurs. 3. In case of military success, it is possible that the saboteurs planned to bring additional forces into the territory of the Russian Federation, but it did not look like a large-scale operation. 4. Several authorities are currently working to establish all the details of the unsuccessful attack by the Ukrainian Sabotage and Reconnaissance Group. The conclusions may become known after the investigation is completed. 5. The collective security system built in Bryansk is exemplary, based on the fact that 100% of attempts to commit sabotage resulted in failures for the AFU. And while some Americans were dying for Ukraine, one American was fighting against Ukraine. Russian special services and military carried out an operation to evacuate an American who played a key role in preparing the assault on Bogoyavlenka near Ugledar. Russian special services and fighters from the 36th Brigade of the Eastern Military District evacuated a valuable operational source, a U.S. citizen who played a key role in preparing the assault on...
That's good work, brother. You got a U.S. citizen, ex-military, doing the right thing over there with the Nazis, giving them up. Yeah, Putin, we over here. All right, give me 30 minutes to get out of here, then blow them up.
The village of Bogoyavlenka in the Ugledar direction. Kenneth M., name changed, spent 2 years in Ukraine, providing Russia with valuable intelligence that allowed it to carry out precision strikes against the AFU.
Now, him and people like him, they do the very valuable work for Russia. That's how Russia know. That's when Russia hit some of these hotels and these pizzerias, when these foreigners, mercenaries, are over there gathering to go to a certain place to get their equipment and then join the fight. One of these guys called the Russians in, and then the Russian kill them, blow them up. Oh, it's some colonels, it's some sergeants. Oh, they finna have a meeting with a general. That's how Russians be knowing. But they just, one American was giving them good information. So Putin had to get him up out of there so they can reward him, and he get to live in Russia forever now.
While minimizing damage to civilian infrastructure and the population.
Tell this story.
The issue of granting political asylum and obtaining Russian citizenship is being resolved. As always, until next time, please enjoy footage from the front line.
Yep. So we just had to start our live off with that very, very late-breaking news. You know, Americans is trapped over there fighting. Americans is dying over there fighting for Ukraine. If anybody want the proof, the Russians are actually posting the proof on TV. The proof is the corpses that they have. And you know the Americans have got to negotiate with Russia to get the bodies back. NATO got to negotiate with Russia. Their families going to want their bodies. And that training exercise shit going to blow up in their face, because Russia said, how did these people die in training exercise unless you're training in Russia?
Physically present in Russia, intermingled with Russian troops. So I'll start with you, Ray. I'm not talking about North Korean troops way eastern Russia, where they have a common border with North Korea and at which they've been training for generations. I'm talking about North Korean troops transported to the areas of conflagration with Ukraine. What is your best understanding as to whether North Korean troops are there or not?
Well, they are there, no doubt. The question is, why is such a big brouhaha being made of this? The Russians and the North Koreans are well within their rights to exercise together, to have troops one another. Actually, they have a mutual defense treaty which obligates them to come to the aid of the other if the other one is invaded militarily. And with the Kursk invasion by Ukraine, of all people, that has happened to Russia. So the Russians are making a political point. Yeah, we can do this. And their representative in the UN made an eloquent statement saying, well, what's special about this? Why do you deny the stuff that you do in NATO all the time? The question is why David Sanger, about a week ago, and now all the press is ringing changes on this terrible threat. Why is Tony Blinken saying there are 8,000 and they're poised to go into Kursk and they're going to finish up those Ukrainians? And if they get involved in combat, there will be every right to retaliate against these North Korean troops. Well, I think there's more to this than meets the eye. South Korean foreign minister and defense ministers were both in Washington the last few days. They had mutual discussions I think that Blinken and Sullivan are trying to get the South Koreans to do something big. There were earlier reports, just one, but was from a good source, that the U.S. was trying to get the South Koreans to give, to put in F-16s with pilots in Romania, right next to Ukraine, and turn the tide of the war, so to speak. Now,
And make an announcement to this effect before Tuesday?
What would have to be, okay? So now they've been pulling the arms of the South Koreans. There's not much in this for the South Koreans, and their president, has been advised, wait. These guys are going to get shut down. This is not going to be good for you politically. So my guess is they haven't persuaded them to give them go ahead to do this. But we'll know in the next couple of days, of course. And even if they don't have the okay, I would expect Blinken to say, we are talking to the South Koreans, and they're, thinking about giving them F-16 pilots, and that will turn the whole tide here. Ukraine hasn't lost yet. And these North Koreans in Russia, the reason for that is the Russians are losing. They don't have enough people. So it's all a big charade.
You can almost hear the words they'll use. Larry, you don't need fodder for your cannon, but I'm going to give you some.
Sure.
Which is Secretary Austin 2 days ago. And then I want you to reply as you see fit. Chris, cut number one.
As you know, we now assess that North Korea has sent around 10,000 of its soldiers to train in eastern Russia. And as Secretary of State pointed out earlier, our most recent information indicates that about 8,000 of those DPRK soldiers are now in the Kursk Oblast. Now, we've not yet seen these soldiers deploy into combat against Ukraine's forces, but we expect that these North Korean soldiers will join the fight against Ukraine in the coming days. Our assessment is that Putin's forces have trained these North Korean soldiers in artillery operations, UAV operations, and basic infantry operations, including trench clearing. The Kremlin has also provided these DPRK troops with Russian uniforms and equipment. And all of that strongly indicates that Russia intends to use these foreign forces in frontline operations in its war of choice against Ukraine. Make no mistake.
This is crazy.
If these North Korean troops engage in combat,
what you gonna do?
Or combat support operations against Ukraine, they would make themselves legitimate military targets.
What a joke. You threatening North Korea, boy? Are you threatening North Korea? Don't make Putin get a word now. Don't make Putin get the word. You talking tough about what you'll do to North Korea after you've been humiliating Ukraine. This is disgusting. After Americans is dying and the bodies is on Russian news, these people got the audacity to do this. This is why this shit so pissed me off. Russians is putting dead NATO members, U.S. soldiers, on the news. These clowns go in here and talk about if North Korea try to enter the battlefield. Man, the world is laughing at the U.S. because they see the desperate nature. You want us to think Putin needs help?
So we are consulting closely with our allies and partners and other countries in the region on these reckless developments and on our response.
Does he even realize what he has just said about soldiers who engage in combat or combat support operations are legitimate military targets? Larry, take it from there. Go at this however you see fit, my friend.
Well, yeah, they're legitimate military targets. The problem with Austin is he's lying. He is either lying or he is the most clueless, uncritical thinker in the world who has been buying lines of cow excrement from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. I need to correct Ray on one thing. David Sanger's article, which was the first place this claim of the North Korean activity appeared, was on October 8th. That's almost 4 weeks ago. This is not of recent development. And the reason it's coming out now, if only people would take time to read the New York Times yesterday, the article was Russia's rapid march in eastern Ukraine. And what they point out is that in July, Russia advanced over 70 square kilometers. And then in August and September, well over 110, 120 square kilometers each month. And now in October, it's over 150. So what is happening is Russia is steamrolling forward. The Ukrainians don't have an answer to the Russian offensive. And this is why I say Austin is lying, because he's claiming, oh, this is why Russia needs the North Koreans, because they're suffering catastrophic losses. Nonsense. It's just the opposite. The only one suffering catastrophic losses is Ukraine. It's not Russia. And it's gotten to the place NATO is alarmed. They don't know what to do. And as Ray correctly noted, the reporting of Marat Karelian, a Russian wartime correspondent, who indicated that the word he was picking up from his Russian intelligence sources was that the West was desperately trying to get South Korea to come in, fly the F-16s as some sort of Hail Mary to try to help stop the bleeding, which they can't. So this is, Austin is being dishonest, because on the one hand, they claim, oh, Russia's had such catastrophic losses, they need the North Koreans. And then in the very next breath, he says, oh, we got to stop Russia, because if we don't, they're going to take over Europe. Well, wait a second. If they need 10,000 North Koreans just to hang on against the Ukrainians, how in the name of God are they going to take over all of Europe? Figure out a story, stick with it, but jumping back and forth like your Bojangles tap dancing is just a bad look.
So, Ray, would the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency be in on this, this charade, or would they be duping the Secretary of Defense? And shouldn't he know that if he's being duped?
Well, this all happened before, Judge, on Vietnam. The CIA then had its own military analytical capability. That's why my friend Sam Adams and others went up against the Pentagon and lost. Our CIA director told us, we can't use those actual figures because there's no way I can protect the US CIA, which is my primary duty, if we get involved in a pissing match with the US Army at war. His exact words, that's what he told our analysts. We had it right. And inevitably, the Viet Cong came down in 500,000, 600,000 numbers rather than the 299,000 that Westmoreland was. That's a long story. So do they lie well, it's real easy to lie now because Bobby Gates, the head of CIA at one point, put the analytical military capability back in the Pentagon. So Austin, who had a record as head of CENTCOM of distorting intelligence to the point where 50 intelligence and analysts in Tampa at CENTCOM and the DIA filed a complaint with the Inspector General of the Pentagon. There was an investigation and so forth. Okay.
And then the investigation went nowhere.
Well, the investigation was by a 2-star, and of course, Austin, who was in charge of CENTCOM, was a 4-star. That's the way it always works. So,
Larry, go ahead, continue.
Yeah, what I'd like to say here is that Larry is exactly right, and I'd say in the beginning that when Larry read those words, we assess. Okay.
Yeah.
We assess that the Russians hacked into the DNC. We assess that Putin
That's some sort of a code phrase. We assess.
Yeah, it's when you don't have any evidence. That's what you do. You assess.
No, Larry. Here's more fodder for your cannon. Secretary Blinken was standing next to Secretary Austin, basically saying the same thing. Chris, cut number 2.
We believe that the entire world should be insisting and demanding that the DPRK cease its provocative actions, both in terms of the repeated missile launches in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and now also providing its troops for Russia's use in this war of aggression against Ukraine. And when it comes to China, as a member of the United Nations Security Council, we would and should expect no less. And we've had communications with China. In fact, we had a robust conversation just this week, and I think they know well the concerns that we have and the expectations that both in word and deed, they'll use the influence that they have to work to curb these activities. So we'll see if they take action. But I think this is a demand signal that's coming not just from us, but from countries around the world.
Do countries around the world believe this nonsense, or do they see this for the chicanery that it is, Larry?
I think most see the chicanery and the hypocrisy. Because just this week, images surfaced first of a dead U.S. Citizen with the 75th Ranger Regiment tat on his shoulder. 75th Rangers are part of what's known as the Tier 2 unit in the Special Operations Forces. So whether this guy was actual current active duty special operations and sheep dipped to be put into Ukraine to operate as an ostensible Ukrainian asset, or if he was a mercenary that went over after the fact, there he was, an American dead inside Russia, along with a Marine, another U.S. citizen who was dead. They got his death picture with his hands up like this, he's like he's fending off an explosion. And then there were Poles and Frenchmen and Brits. So you got all these NATO people running into Ukraine fighting Russians. And now Blinken wants to get his panties in a wad because, oh my God, the North Koreans who've had a military relationship with Russia for 75 years are having relations. It is, you know what? It's so pathetic. It's shameful because I think there's a lot of countries out there just shaking their head, looking at the United States and going, man, when did that clown car empty out?
Revolutionary salute to our Queen Shannon G for the donation to the war chest, the super sticker. Revolution is a way of life. I absolutely appreciate the love, Queen. Salute to you.
Because this is ridiculous.
Surely, Ray McGovern, the Secretary of Defense would know that there are Americans, Poles, Brits, whomever they may be, on the ground fighting with Ukraine. How could he not know that?
Well, that's different, Judge. The U.S. has special privileges to do these things, and there's no laws against it. We do. I mean,
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and we haven't been Kursk, right, Larry? There are some people in Kursk from NATO. So, the difference, the difference in who's entitled to do what is really very glaring. And you're quite right to point out the rest of the world looks on and say, what's going to happen on the 5th? Now, I'd like to add one other point. One thing that makes it more likely for me that this miracle, this Hail Mary pass or Deus Ex Machina comes out of Blinken and says, we got it all checked because the South Koreans are coming to the rescue like the cavalry, is because Blinken himself may end up in jail if that other guy comes into office. Why? Because just at this time in 2020, he encouraged this guy, CIA acting director, Mikey Morell,
right,
to round up 50 other high-ranking intelligence officials to say Hunter Biden's laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence disinformation operation. Then Mikey Morell had his own name, 51, and that was used effectively at the last debate where Trump was not smart enough not to ask about this, and Biden said, my God, don't you know that 51 intelligence directors have said that?
So, I remember, shameful. I remember this. I have a friend, I won't give you his name, significant person in the military and intelligence communities, although a liberal Democrat, who was asked to sign this and he refused. He's told me several times in private, this is junk and garbage. These people are my friends that signed it, but I'm not putting my name on it.
We have a friend, Larry and I, who is a recipient of the Sam Adams Award for Integrity, who signed. And when I called him on it, he said, I'm just avid to make sure that Trump doesn't win. Oh my God, that's not what an intelligence officer does.
No,
back to the story. Now, it was Blinken that set this whole thing up. Blinken called Mikey Morell and said, "Can you do this?" Mikey said, "Of course we can." 51, and the debate just dismissed this whole issue. Now, did it turn the tide? Well, it certainly didn't help. It didn't help Trump. And so there are these things that are going in Blinken's mind and Sullivan's mind. My God, what is he going to do? I mean, we're going to be out of a job for sure, but will we be able to hang out hide in the desks at Brookings, or is it going to get us? It's that serious for these guys personally.
Larry, last Sunday, I participated in a program with Scott Ritter and Dennis Fritz and Colonel Larry Wilkerson on the east side of Manhattan, and we spoke to a group of a couple of 100 anti-war activists. While we spoke on the east side of Manhattan, a madman addressed 25,000 people on the west side of Manhattan. Chris has cut it down to a minute. If you can tolerate this, you'll know who it is in a heartbeat. Yeah, I'd like to know what you think of it, Chris. Cut number 7.
They are our best friend. I worked for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. Ronald Reagan said, "We have to be there for Israel always because they are always there for us."
Yes, they are.
Hamas is not there for us. Iran is not there for us. They want to kill us. And the Palestinians are taught to kill us at 2 years old. They won't let a Palestinian in Jordan. They won't let a Palestinian in Egypt. And Harris wants to bring them to you. They may have good people. I'm sorry, I don't take a risk with people that are taught to kill Americans at 2. I'm on the side of Israel. You're on the side of Israel. Donald Trump's on the side of Israel. And they're on the side of the terrorists.
We keep the electoral politics out of it. Is there any evidence that Iranians want to kill Americans, Larry?
No, not coming over here. And look, this is, it's really embarrassing to see Giuliani become this sort of deranged and unhinged at his age.
I love to see.
There was a time where he was not this crazy.
Right.
But let's simply deal with facts. According to the U.S. State Department's now Bureau of Counterterrorism, it was the office of the coordinator with counterterrorism when I was there. Every year, they put out a report on who's the most active terrorist groups and nations. And every year, they list Iran as a major sponsor of terrorism. Okay, that's true. But then you look at the statistical annex, and what do those numbers say? They list the top 10 groups that are responsible for like 95% of the terrorist activities. Not a single one of those for 2022, 2021, 2020, 2019, going back, not a single one is sponsored by Iran, funded by Iran, trained by Iran. The groups Hezbollah and Hamas, ironically, have carried out very, very few terrorist attacks. And the terrorist attacks that Hezbollah has carried out primarily against the United States have always been actually against military and government targets. They have not gone after civilians per se. Now, nobody wants to hear those facts. We instead pretend to create this mythological enemy when, we were the ones in part helping fund Iran, arm Iran back in the early 1980s. I mean, we were playing both sides of the fence.
Right.
We were providing arms and weapons to the Iranians and arms and weapons to the Iraqis. Ali North was wheeling and dealing with Iran. That's how they got those shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, the Stingers. So this is blatant hypocrisy again, and it's just pandering to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee.
The other thing that he said is that Israel has been there for us. Israel has never been there for us. I guess he forgot about the USS Liberty.
Yeah, exactly.
Ray,
poor Rudy, I'm from New York and I know a little bit about Rudy. He's lost his penthouse now, for God's sake. I think he's lost his license to be a lawyer, right? And,
Yes.
and he's lost whatever
Lost it.
lingering reputation he has, because during those hearings about September 6th or whatever, there was the attorney general for the state of Georgia, and he said he got a call from Rudy, and Rudy said, corruption. You got to look into that corruption. Look at that. And the attorney general said, well, I said to Rudy, I said, well, this is serious. What's your evidence? We have no evidence, just reports. Just look into it. So no evidence. We assess there has been corruption. So poor Julie, it's hard for me to feel sorry. Poor Giuliani, hard for me to feel sorry for him. But he's got his just desserts now, and no more girlfriends and no more penthouse.
Going back to last weekend, when the Israelis began their assault on Iran, and they didn't have the second wave or the third wave. They didn't even finish the first wave, according to Alistair. Their jets flew over Jordan and flew over Iraq.
Yeah.
Is the king of Jordan a CIA asset or a CIA stooge?
Well, he's had a close relationship. I don't know if he has ever officially signed up as a source, but what they lack, both Iraq and Jordan, is air defense systems. If they had any kind of credible air defense system, Israel wouldn't dare to do that. What's telling, and I think Alistair had it exactly right, because if Israel had hit the kinds of targets that it's been claiming, and you know, in the media side, the spin back in Israel is, oh, we wiped out those Iranians, we wiped out their air defense system, they didn't have it there, we took out this plant and that plant. Where are the pictures? This is just like saying, those Hamas terrorists beheaded babies. Where are the names? Give us the names, the photographs. Show us the babies when they were not beheaded. They can't do it because it didn't happen. And what happened here was Israel is loath to admit that they got stopped, and that their plan, because when you compare what Gallant was saying before they launched, it was going to be devastating. The world was going to be standing in shock and awe of what Israel accomplished. And you know what? That night, when Israel basically called it off, everybody else was singing Peggy Lee's song, Is That All There Is? Because there wasn't a lot to it.
Let's go back to where we started. How much longer, regardless of the outcome on Tuesday, how much longer can Ukraine last? Larry has seen videos of the Ukrainian military shelling its own people who were trying to run from Ukraine into Russia. How much longer can that country possibly last? Larry and then Ray.
Well, I think it could come to a crashing conclusion as early as end of December. I don't see how it extends beyond the end of March or April. Just look at the New York Times piece and the chart of the capture of the land. It's going up, and that rate of acceleration is not slowing; it's increasing.
Yeah, the land.
Right.
The land is important, but more important really are the troops that are being sacrificed in this whole thing. I would say November, if a certain person wins. In other words, it depends on what happens in the election.
Right.
If Trump wins, I would not expect the Ukrainians to be able to stand fast. They'll be running away. They'll be giving up. They will say, well, look, what's the use? If Kamala wins, then I suppose I'd pick Larry's time frame, but it's not very long, and it all has to do with when a very debilitated president is calling the shots, depending on who he listens to now or the next day. So it's very, very conflicted, and it's very unpredictable, and that worries the Russians, Chinese, Iranians. It worries everybody sick. What's going to happen for these until January 20th, when there's a change in our government?
Apologies for going back and forth. Here's a very debilitated ex-president, and we'll again keep the politics out as to what the heck he was doing in Michigan. I don't know if you guys have seen this.
Oh, yes.
But I have to show it to you. Cut number 6.
I have to be careful what I say because there's only one president at a time. But I think we're going to have to essentially start again on the peace process. I understand why young Palestinian and Arab Americans in Michigan think too many people have died. I get that. But if you lived in one of those kibbutzim in Israel, right next to Gaza, and Hamas butchered them. And so then the people who criticize it are essentially saying, yeah, but look how many people you've killed in retaliation. So how many is enough for you to kill to punish them for the terrible things they did? That all sounds nice until you realize, what would you do if it was your family? You would say, well, you'll have to forgive me. I'm not keeping score that way. It isn't how many we've had to kill, because Hamas makes sure that they're shielded by civilians. They'll force you to kill civilians if you want to defend yourself.
Israel got him on the Epstein tape.
Yeah. Not sure who's worse, Larry, Giuliani or Clinton, when it comes to facts and history.
Yeah, I mean, it's just disgusting, despicable. The same guy who's basically raked in millions of dollars using the Haitians as shields to justify his profit making. Look, the fact of the matter is that right now the number of civilians that have been murdered by the Israelis after using the actions of October 7th, where 1,200 were allegedly killed by Hamas, but the reality is far fewer, because the Israeli government itself, through their Hannibal doctrine, was responsible for killing, I would estimate, at least 500 to 600 of the Israelis who died that day.
How many people have died in Gaza? Do we have a number?
Yeah, it's over 45,000. And when you add in what's going on in Lebanon, it's over 5,000. We're over 50,000. So at what point do you say, okay, we've killed enough? Because what has been exposed now is the reality of the Zionist plan. They're not looking to reach an agreement, a negotiation with the Palestinians where they say, okay, you give us our hostages back, we'll separate, you live on your side of the wall, we'll live on our side of the wall, and we'll try to get along. That's not what they want. They want to eliminate the Palestinians, exterminate them, wipe them out, kill them if necessary, starve them if they can, force them to flee, but they want them out of that land because the Zionists insist. That land is theirs. It doesn't belong to any of these lousy Palestinians who aren't even real human beings.
Because God gave it to them? They really believe that?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why you had Netanyahu talking about Amalek. We got to kill the Amaleks. And that instruction to the Jews in the Old Testament to kill everybody, men, women, and children, because that was God's command. Well, when you write the book, you get to control the narrative.
I just add about Bill Clinton. He was the one that started the expansion of NATO against the promise that was made earlier. He also hired a bunch of Zionists to work with him on the Middle East. And with these Zionists, he put a lot of pressure on Yasser Arafat, and Arafat finally didn't trust him. And Arafat was right. And so what happened to Arafat? He was poisoned. He was removed from the scene. So this is a guy who is largely responsible for the fact that a fair deal for the Palestinians has been put off for as long as Clinton was president. That was a long time. And so he's likely responsible for this. And for him to be parroting this business about, the way they shield and all this kind of things, it's such male bovine excrement that it's not worthy of even listening to.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time as always. You both are so gracious and generous as to give us double duty.
Well, an update now to a bombshell story we brought you last week. Last week, Dan Cohen from Uncaptured Media revealed the plans to rebuild Gaza using concentration camps, yes, orchestrated by the CIA. These concentration camps would keep Palestinians in them under 24-hour surveillance using biometric scanners. Well, now we know who's actually behind this. Yes, the very same face behind the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq, the failed counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Dan Cohen from Uncaptured Media is back. Dan, it's been a very busy weekend. I mean, on the front part of this, you have Israel this weekend admitting that their war is essentially failing, that they have no compass. This isn't like some left-wing newspaper report. This is coming right from Israel itself. And now we have this bombshell new report that you've just uncovered about who's actually behind these concentration camps. Break it all down for us, if you would.
Yeah, Clayton. So the Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on Sunday admitted, he wrote in a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu and the security cabinet that the war is being conducted without a compass. So they really don't have any strategy. They don't know what they're doing. They're just going to occupy areas in Gaza. They, of course, kill a lot of civilians, but they don't actually defeat the armed resistance groups, namely Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the kind of junior partner here. So then they go on to the next one, and the Palestinian resistance continues to exist. And meanwhile, Israel's losing soldiers on nearly a daily basis. And over the last month, things have gotten much worse as it's gone into Lebanon, and it's losing even more soldiers. So the whole image of Israel that it's going to be able to defeat these resistance forces is failing. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we saw Hezbollah manage to hit Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's house with a suicide drone. So things are not going well for the Israelis, and Gallant admitted as much here. So what they've done is now, he said in this letter, we need an alternative to Hamas rule in Gaza. So they want to basically have regime change by one way or another. They need a strategy to approve that, or to achieve that, rather. And so now the Biden administration, which, again, not really Biden, not really Kamala Harris, neither of whom have any idea what's going on. Biden obviously is senile, and I don't know what Kamala's excuse is, but I'm sure she's got one. Jake Sullivan is running the show in the Biden administration, this unelected bureaucrat, and he has approved a plan concocted by none other than the father, the face of the failed counterinsurgency doctrine strategy, the so-called surge in Iraq, David Petraeus, who not only did he fail there, but he also, when he was briefly the CIA director under Obama, he slept with his biographer and gave her classified information. So not a very upstanding character.
Now we're elevating David Petraeus once again. Like this guy, a deep state swamp rat who basically gave away classified information, basically treasonous against the United States government, is now back in the picture and involved in the rebuilding of Gaza. Like this, you can't make this up.
Yeah, actually, I want to show you this soundbite that I dug up from David Petraeus pitching this concentration camp plan just a few weeks ago.
I believe there should be a vision for the future of the Palestinian people that is similar to the vision that we presented to the people of Iraq before we conducted the major operations that we did there during the surge. And we would go to the people of Fallujah and we would tell them in advance of our operation, we are going to make your lives better. We're going to do it by getting Al-Qaeda out of your neighborhoods. And then we're going to stay in those neighborhoods. We're going to create gated communities, essentially. It's an accurate description, but with much more effective walls. In fact, we would tell them, I said, look, it costs a lot of money to be in a gated community in Florida, and we're going to give it to you for free here in Fallujah.
I mean, he's saying all of that, Dan, with a straight face. Like, this is comparable to like going to Boca Raton in Florida, where you could also probably go golfing. But we're going to do it even better because it's going to be biometrically scanned. We're going to monitor your movements 24/7. Like, it's hilarious that they're actually pitching this, and not even pitching it, they're going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, he actually, he kind of cracks a little smile. He thinks he's being funny, and you actually hear the laughs from the audience. So I don't know who's in the audience there at Rice University, but that's just total psychopath behavior to think of taking people who have survived an entire year of genocide, who have seen their families killed, taken away into torture, and worse things that happen that maybe we shouldn't mention on air, in these prisons. And David Petraeus, from the comfort of the stage, is joking about rounding these people into these, what he call, gated communities, he likes to call them, where they will not be allowed to receive food or water unless they present a biometric ID that proves they are not affiliated in any way with Hamas. Not just they're a resistance fighter, but if you're a doctor or an engineer that was somehow affiliated with a government municipality or something like that, you're just a regular person, you will be forced to starve. That's what he's proposing. So that's just, it's just the epitome of evil. But what I found, and in my piece that I published at Uncaptured Media, is that David Petraeus actually is set to personally profit from this. He's a partner at a global investment firm called KKR, which is like a junior sort of BlackRock. And KKR owns Constellus, which is the current iteration of Blackwater, the notorious mercenary outfit that was, famous and for committing, for example, the Nisour Square massacre in Iraq during the 2006, 2007, I believe. And so, of course, it rebranded to Academy and is now Constellus. And David Petraeus' company, his firm, that's one of their assets. Now, Constellus is being contracted by this guy, Mordecai Moti Kahana, who's an Israeli-American businessman, who's basically the conduit, who's been pitching this to the Israeli Ministry of Defense and to people like the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. So he arranged meetings actually back in November of 2023, he arranged a meeting between an American general who he doesn't identify, who was in Iraq, but is pretty obviously Petraeus, and Gallant and other people from the Ministry of Defense to pitch this. At that point, probably they thought they were going to, cruise to victory in Gaza. But as things have gotten progressively worse, they haven't achieved any of their goals, and they've seen actually more captives turn out to be dead, or they've bombed them themselves. Now they're getting more and more desperate, admitting that they don't actually have any strategy, they don't have any way to win. And so the Ministry of Defense, Gallant, is like, look, we're getting soldiers killed on a daily basis. This isn't going well. We need some kind of way out. And so they are happy. The army chiefs are happy to have some kind of foreign CIA special force come in and run these concentration camps to take the load off the shoulders of the army. That's basically his pitch.
CIA coming into Gaza to build concentration camps, to monitor 24/7 Palestinians, the comings and goings of these people. I mean, I as an American citizen didn't sign up for this. And how are American tax dollars being signed off on by the Biden administration being funneled to this treasonous deep state swamp monster, David Petraeus, is mind-boggling and deeply troubling. He makes the comparison to Fallujah and Iraq, right? He's like, we're going to, protect you, and we're ridding Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is removed from this area. So we're going to come in and build these high-rise apartment buildings, gated communities, just like Florida. But of course, he's trying to compare that to Gaza. Well, it's totally different, because there's no elimination of Hamas. Hamas is there, arguably just as strong as they were on October 7th. So this idea that you're going to come in and now there's no fighters at all is ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a totally broken strategy from the start. Even in Iraq, it totally failed because, counterinsurgency doctrine is based on this idea that a place is occupied by extremists that don't have any connection to the actual population, and that there's no legitimate complaint from the population. So it's, we're going to separate the civilians from the extremists. We'll take out the civilians and everything will be great. But as long as you're keeping these people in, concentration camps, or you're occupying and controlling their lives, they're going to resist. So it's just this total denial of reality. And that's why it has failed in virtually every instance it's been applied. I mean, in the US experience post World War II, they tried the same thing in Vietnam with the strategic Hamlet plan. That failed. We all know how the Vietnam War ended. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, they did this stuff and it failed every single time, and it guaranteed will fail in Gaza if they even get to try it. I'm skeptical they could even pull it off, because imagine, they take these trucks and take these big cement walls and try to start to erect them in the Gaza Strip. Well, the resistance that's operating in this massive tunnel complex is still very capable. It's not broken down. It's not even an insurgency. They're still operating as a national military where they have phone lines, closed phone lines throughout Gaza, where you have a commander who knows where in Gaza watching on cameras to tell the fighters how to carry out an operation. He's literally watching on cameras they've installed, preparing these operations and instructing them on exactly what to do, and watching the Israeli army movements. So when that tank or that APC or supply truck comes through, they're able to use an explosive that they've actually manufactured in Gaza. They're taking the Israeli weapons, the Israeli bombs that are duds, that don't explode, and they take those and basically reverse engineer them or turn them into their own improvised explosives in order to carry out these operations. So as long as that's going on and the Israelis really have no answer for that, I think this whole concentration camp concept is pretty much a fantasy. And it's just the Americans, the US government, the CIA is offering the Israelis a different poison than the one they're taking right now, which is just permanent occupation in Gaza with no actual strategy other than just the government wants to stay in power, because they know the second that the government collapses, they go to elections, their heads are going to roll. People are going to want to know, why did October 7th actually happen? How did you let this happen? You failed to protect us. And now all these promises about we're going to win in Gaza and, we're going to win together. That's the big line in Israel. Those are a total farce. So they don't have any way to win. And, they're just taking this thing deeper and deeper into into just a descent that I don't think they're going to come out of.
Real quick, Dan, I'll get you out of here real quick on this. Israel has been really quiet on the number of IDF and Israeli soldiers that have been killed in these operations. I don't know that we have honest numbers, but from your reporting, do you happen to have a sense of how many Israeli IDF soldiers have been killed in these attacks inside of Lebanon when they've gone into these encampments? Do you have any idea? Because, Israeli moms and fathers, right, when they know that their children are being killed in these operations, and they have no compass, as the Israeli Defense Ministry says, they have no compass to win this war. That's not going to, we know how it goes in Vietnam. We know how it went in Afghanistan. We know how it went in Iraq and the United States. And families are going to demand an answer to this. But anyway, do you have any numbers on this by any chance?
Well, the official numbers of how many Israeli soldiers have been killed since October 7th, and that includes October 7th itself, is 771 right now, which may or may not sound like a lot of soldiers, but when you consider that Israel is a small country, it's actually quite a lot. I mean, if you just compare the population of the United States, what are we, 350 million, where the Jewish Israeli population is 6 million. So if you compare those, I mean, that's many, 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 many times more than 50 times roughly as many soldiers. Imagine that many American soldiers dying in some war, how the American public would be looking at it. And then on top of that, you have more than 11,000 injured. So it's not just a matter of if they're dead or not. It's if they can't fight, if they're dead or injured, it doesn't matter. They cannot fight. So there's more than 11,000 of them. And then you have soldiers who are refusing to enlist, not because of some moral outrage, but because they're psychologically broken. They're defeated. They see we're just going back again and again to the same places that we said we conquered in November and December of 2023 or March or April of this year, and I saw my friends get killed there. Why would I go back there again? So it's getting worse and worse. The Israelis just, I mean, it's just stunning that they've admitted that they don't even have a strategy and they're continuing to escalate.
Unbelievable. You can read more of Dan's great reporting at Uncaptured Media. His new update on
Israel carried out a targeted attack last weekend. Now, while Iranian officials have noted that this attack left limited damage on Iranian military sites, that doesn't change the fact that Israel is openly targeting Iran in a number of ways. Although if you ask the Associated Press here in the West, they say that this is Israel's first open, right, public attack against Iran. But we know that Israel's attacks involving targeted assassinations and a number of other attacks have been present for years now. So to act as though this is the first time that Israel is quote unquote acting out, to act as though Israel is retaliating to Iran's actual retaliatory attack back on October 1st would be disingenuous to what is actually going on. But a lot of questions still remain as to what Iran is going to do, how they are going to retaliate, and of course, the all too important question of when it is going to happen. Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Syed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know that after Israel's attack on Iran last weekend, Iran has noted that it left limited damage, while Iran's foreign ministry spokesman also said that Tehran will, quote, use all available tools to deliver a definite and effective response to the Zionist regime. What do you think he means by that, and what could that response look like?
For the Iranians, it's not really important that the Israeli regime's attack was not really very successful. What is most important was that this was an act of aggression, and therefore the country has to respond. Because if it does not respond, then that will only encourage the Israeli regime to carry out further strikes. We know that Tel Aviv does not listen to anyone. It's carrying out a genocide in Gaza. This genocide has been going on for over a year. No one has stopped it. So there's no reason to believe that the Israeli regime is going to stop attacking Iran. Therefore, the Iranians believe that the only possible solution is for the regime to be punished so that it will regret attacking Iran and thus establishing deterrence through a strike. Of course, it's possible that the Israelis would respond with another strike, but I think the Iranians have decided that they will continue striking the Israelis until Netanyahu is forced to end this type of aggression.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch too. I know that, the last time around we had this waiting period that went on for weeks, right? Of waiting and wondering, okay, what is Iran going to do? I know a lot of people are looking to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, to see what he has said. He responded to the attack saying that Iranian officials should determine how best to demonstrate Iran's power to Israel, adding that the Israeli attack should neither be downplayed nor exaggerated. Now, how do you see this statement, and does it reflect the limited damage that Israel was able to do in this case?
Yes, it obviously it's clear that the Israelis were not able to do a great deal. Otherwise, we would have seen huge explosions. One of the key areas that was attacked was right beside Tehran, very close to where we live. If there were explosions, we would have seen fire, and we would have heard the sounds here in Tehran, especially to the east of Tehran where we are, but nothing happened. 4 officers were murdered by the Israelis, but they had to do with Iran's air defense systems. And so they did do some damage, obviously, to those systems, or some of them. But by and large, most of the missiles were destroyed in the air. Very little damage was caused. But again, Ayatollah Khamenei, in that speech, what he was saying was that there has to be a response in order to, and deterrence must be established. But he was also saying that the politicians or the political leaders in the country, along with the military, have to sit down and see what sort of response there should be, what type of response there should be, what size, how many missiles, or how many drones, let's say, should be used in response to the sort of attack that was carried out. So we'll have to wait and see what the decision is and when the strike will take place. But I think that it's been decided that Iran will strike the Israeli regime directly.
Yeah, and it's interesting too when it comes to the media coverage, especially looking at the way that the Western media has portrayed all of this, because you have the Associated Press describing this as, quote, the first time that Israel's military has openly attacked Iran. Now, we know that Israel has obviously been targeting Iran for a long time with a variety of attacks and assassinations. But how do you see that the way that the Western media has tried to make Israel's attack seem as if it's some sort of larger than life plan, or at the same time, they're acting like Israel was the one retaliating, as if Iran's October 1st retaliation, their actual retaliatory attack, was just some sort of standalone attack against Israel?
Well, that's exactly what Western governments do, and Western media really is almost the same as they say they're almost the same thing as Western governments. So when the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, that was Iranian territory. And when Iran took its complaints to the UN Security Council, the United States, Britain, and France, and Germany, they supported the Israelis. So they supported the airstrike on the Iranian embassy. So obviously, we should not be surprised when Western media pretends that this is really the first attack on Iran. We've had many years of attack. Over the years, we've had many attacks against Iranians by the Israeli regime. We had the Israelis and the Americans carry out the world's first cyber attack on Iran years ago. Then they murdered a number of Iranian scientists. One of them was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran. He was murdered in front of his wife. Then we had Iranian officers who were fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria during the previous decade, who were murdered by the Israelis who were supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the dirty war in Syria. And more recently, we had the murder of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, who was invited to Iran by the president-elect at that time for his inauguration, and he was murdered in an official government guest house. So if none of these are attacks on Iran, then what does constitute an attack on a country?
Yeah, that's an excellent question there. And I would love to ask the Western media, right? They act like everything just kind of happens in a bubble, like there's no context to really anything that's happening right now. Now, speaking of the Western media coverage, because the New York Times has a new report out this week with the title, How Russia, China, and Iran Are Interfering in the Presidential Election. Because not only does not only is there no context, but they also have to make everything about the US. They claim that Russia favors Donald Trump and Iran favors Kamala Harris. Now, I personally can't think of any reason why Iran would have any favorite candidate in this race, but how do you think that the Iranian government sees the upcoming US presidential election? Do they expect any sort of a change based on whoever is elected?
No. After what the Biden regime has done to Gaza and after what they've done to Lebanon, there is no way in the world that the Iranians would prefer the status quo in the United States. Although Iran has no expectations, neither Kamala Harris nor Trump are decent human beings. Neither of them care for the Palestinian people. Both of them have supported ethno-supremacism. They've supported the genocide and Holocaust in Gaza and the slaughter in Lebanon and the lawlessness that the Israeli regime follows and it's lawless. They support its lawless behavior across the board. So Iran doesn't support either side, but there's no reason whatsoever to think that after all that has happened over the last year, Iran would in any way support Kamala Harris. That's beyond belief. I don't see how anyone in the West could conclude such a thing.
Yeah, I don't either, right? And I'm looking at this going, okay, that's your assessment. I mean, I understand why they don't support Donald Trump, but it's not as if Harris has been any kind of champion for peace in the Middle East. And speaking of peace, the possibility of any kind of ceasefire, how do you see kind of the timing that we're in right now? I know we've got this election coming up next week here in the US, and it almost seems like there's kind of okay, let's wait to see what the results are. Do you see that as being a legitimate waiting period, or is this just about Israel trying to buy more time, knowing that they're not likely to agree to a ceasefire agreement for either Lebanon or Gaza?
I don't think that there's any serious talk of a ceasefire. Whatever is coming from Western media and Washington is for internal consumption. Biden and Harris want to be seen as trying to put an end to this, but they're simply buying time. They are fully supporting the Israeli regime as we speak. The Israelis are bombing civilian targets in Lebanon. They've murdered a large number of medics today in different parts of Lebanon. It's clear that they're targeting medics, and they are continuing with the genocide in Gaza. The United States and Germany and other countries send weapons and ammunition every day, and there is no reason to believe that this is serious at all.
Yeah, and when it comes to those just massacres and atrocities that Israel is carrying out, as you noted there, I mean, it does seem like on a daily basis, right, we hear more about what they're doing to the people of Lebanon, or just the horrific siege that they are carrying out on northern Gaza, literally trying to starve out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians there. And, I look around and maybe this is just a level of impatience, right? Going, okay, someone needs to do something. How do you view the position that the region is in right now? And how do you think that Iran views it as they're kind of trying to balance all of these things, but still trying to keep the focus on the Palestinians and now the Lebanese civilians that are being targeted?
Well, on the one hand, the Iranians have a responsibility to punish the Israeli regime and to create deterrence. But obviously, the Iranians will do it in a way which helps Gaza and which helps Lebanon. And in addition to that, the Iranians do want to make sure that the global majority, the global South, sees that its response is a response to Israeli aggression, and that it is not Iran that is provoking the other side, and it's not Iran that's pushing the region towards a regional war. It's clear that the only side that wants a regional war is the Israeli regime, the only side that's carrying out genocide is the Israeli regime, and Iran wants to make sure that the focus stays on Israel. And one of the reasons why Iran does or has in the past delayed its response, and so far we've seen a brief delay, at least until now, in before the next response. I think it's because Iran wants to make sure in communications with different governments, through its embassies and through senior officials, that everyone understands that this is a direct response, or Iran's actions are in direct response to Israeli aggression. There is a balancing act here that's being carried out. On the one hand, Iran has to punish them. It has to also help the resistance, both through the punishment, but also through direct assistance. And at the same time, it has to keep the global South well informed about the situation and about the fact that Iran is simply responding to Israeli aggression, and the response is intended to prevent the regime from carrying out further aggression.
And I think that that's good to keep in mind, and also to look around at the region and to see really the role that Iran is playing. It's one that a number of other countries are, well, I would say, scared to do, but right, they don't want to be in the position that Iran is in right now, of actually wanting to stand up for the civilians that are being targeted by Israel with the help of the US. And I thought it was interesting too, the US Department of Defense put out a statement in which it said that, quote, the Israeli strike in Iran should mark the end of the tit for tat between the two nations. And to think that this is just some tit for tat battle, right? It's like, oh, Israel and Iran, they're just kind of going back and forth at it again, it's kind of maddening to me, right? Because you're taking away all of the context, the fact that there is an ongoing genocide right now that Israel is carrying out, the fact that Iran is a part of this axis of resistance that is actually pushing for some form of accountability for Israel when so many other countries around the world won't do it. How do you see the position that the international community is playing right now, and even kind of this mindset coming the US that, oh, okay, it should be done now, right? This back and forth, that should be all there is to it, as if there isn't a lot of other atrocities that Israel is continuing to carry out.
You're absolutely correct. But I think it also reveals something else that is very important. And that is that if the United States and the West, or the Israeli regime, thinks that the Israeli strike on Iran was a
revolutionary salute to our brother Big Joe Nate for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is real life. I absolutely appreciate the love, brother. Salute to you.
Success. I don't think the Americans really would want this exchange to end. They would like to see it continue so that the Israeli regime could press its advantage, and it could degrade Iran's military capabilities. But the statement actually reveals that the opposite is true. The Israeli regime is unable to harm Iran seriously, to bring about significant damage to Iran's defensive and offensive capabilities, whereas the Iranians have the ability to really cause a lot of pain and suffering for the Israeli regime. So the statement itself, I think, is evidence enough that the Israelis are not doing well in their offensive striking or attempts to strike Iran, and that the Iranians have been very effective in punishing the Israeli regime. And I think that's why the Iranians will definitely punish the Israeli regime again. And one thing that I'd like to also add here, although it's not related to the question, is that for over 4 decades, Iran has been demonized by the Western media, by Western governments, by international institutions controlled by the West, human rights bodies that are controlled by the West, funded by the West. But today, when we look at what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon, we see that the collective West is supporting a Holocaust. They're supporting genocidal strikes by an ethno-supremacist regime that carries out ethnic cleansing and that believes in racial hierarchy and domination, an apartheid state it is as well. Iran is on one side opposing this, the West is on the other side supporting this regime. So my belief is that those people who've been influenced by this narrative for the last 4 decades or for over 4 decades should really rethink Iran. Because what does this say about Iran being the lone country that is supporting or leading this axis of resistance, which is in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria, and Lebanon, and of course in Palestine? And it is, on the other hand, we have the collective West that is supporting the Israeli regime. My argument is that most of that narrative that people are influenced, that has influenced people across the world, that discourse that has caused a lot of skepticism towards Iran in the eyes of, or which has created a lot of skepticism in the minds of many people across the world. People should start questioning them. They should start questioning those narratives, that discourse, that anti-Iranian discourse, and they should think that maybe maybe the opposite is true. What is it about the Islamic Republic of Iran that makes it so adamant in its support for the victims? And what is wrong with the West, which makes it so supportive of racist aggressors?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And yeah, it's like Iran could just as easily say, no, we're good. We're, do what other governments in the region have done and have said, oh, yeah, we want to see a ceasefire, but then they kind of leave it at that and don't attempt to take it any further. And as you were talking there, I was thinking about the fact that, here in the US, that's very similar to the treatment of Russia, right? We have this Cold War mentality. The US has taken the steps to decide, okay, these are the bad guys, right? Looking at Russia, looking at Iran, now trying to add China into that as well, which is, of course, why they claim that these are the 3 countries, the trifecta of election interference. And yet, what we're watching is that these countries that the US has tried to target and isolate, they're not being isolated. The US is becoming the one that is now going to eventually become more isolated because of its own policies, because of the genocide that it's supporting. But I thought it was notable. We had Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov coming out this week and saying that Russia and Iran intend to sign a new treaty soon that will include closer defense cooperation. Lastly, how do you see the position that Iran is in right now as it is strengthening its ties with countries like Russia? It is a member of the BRICS alliance, and it's proving that despite all of the pressure and all of the sanctions from the US, it is not isolated from the rest of the world.
A lot has been said about BRICS over the past few weeks, and I'm sure you've covered this extensively, so I don't want to repeat things that you've already said to your audience. But there's no doubt that the world is changing very fast. The West is increasingly marginalized. They've destroyed their credibility across the world because of their support for this Holocaust in Gaza. Militarily, they failed in Ukraine. They've also failed to isolate Russia. And their economies collectively are going downhill very fast, whereas the global majority or the global South has a very different situation. And Western policies have driven Iran and Russia and other countries closer to each other. Now that Iran and Russia have established such good ties, especially since the war in Ukraine began, it's interesting how many Russians and Iranians are wondering why we didn't do this earlier, why efforts weren't made to push for the establishment of the North-South transport corridor, which makes so much sense. So a lot of this has been brought about because of the West. The West has pushed different countries towards one another and has brought about a new thinking among these countries. They've been exploring new ways to do trade. They've been exploring new ways to do business. And the relationships are evolving very quickly, especially across Asia, which is where the global economy has shifted to. So BRICS is reflective to a large degree, in my opinion, to a very large degree of Western policy. If it wasn't for the policies pursued by the West, weaponizing the dollar, sanctions, using financial institutions as weapons by Western countries, I do not think that we would have had BRICS today. And if we did have BRICS, it would have been just some sort of symbolic organization where a few heads of states would meet every now and then. But BRICS is very serious. It's not going to change the world tomorrow, but it is going to bring about change. And it is, of course, one very important organization alongside other regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are growing, and all of them are excluding the West. Why is it that different regions are excluding the West? Because they all feel that the West is behaving in a manner which is detrimental to their interests. So the West is its own worst enemy. And they get angry about BRICS. They see BRICS as a threat. But in reality, BRICS just wants to have a more fair system. The West wants to control the world. They want to marginalize whoever they don't like. And the rest of the world is getting tired of this. And since the rest of the world today, or much of the rest of the non-Western world, is much more powerful than it was before, and the West has exhausted itself through endless wars and through liberal capitalism, and by supporting genocide, the West is no longer interesting for the rest of us. And we'd rather work without the West to build our countries. And if the West in future changes its policies, obviously everyone would like to have good relations with them, just like they'd like to have good relations with other countries. But for the time being, the West has marginalized itself. And I think it has created this great opportunity for non-Western countries to explore stronger relations, better economic ties, closer political ties, closer cultural ties, and closer academic ties.
Yeah, you can only be the bully for so long before the majority, the rest of the world, kind of wake up and go, wait a second, we don't have to continue living like this. And alliances, exactly as you were saying, like the BRICS alliance, are kind of born out of that realization of, oh, we can all work together and we become stronger than when we allow ourselves to just be isolated by the US because they decided that we're the country that they are going to target at the moment. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. Syed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran, thank you so much.
Old gang just never quit. Like the Sputnik radio hosts are not getting paid anymore, but they're still doing the same thing. I've had now interviews with you, two or three interviews with Rachel Blevins, who's got her own show, a couple interviews with Jamarl Thomas from Fault Lines on his own show, an interview with Ted Rall and Manila, who have got their own TMI show now, previously the Final Countdown. So it's almost like you people really believed in what you were saying and doing and talking.
Well, let me tell you, and the conversation hasn't changed. Of course, around here, let's see, we got Donald Trump cooking French fries and riding around in a garbage truck. We got Kamala babbling incoherently as always. My God, we do know she came up in a middle-class family and they were proud of their lawns. Other than that, ain't not a whole lot there. But at any rate, at least we have some people in your part of the world that have a few brain cells between their ears. So let's talk about that. Let's get started with Georgia. Georgia on my mind, as Ray Charles said, going back to Georgia. I think that was
Georgia, sweet Georgia. No,
yeah,
not
the
that
Queen
Georgia.
of Soul. A lot of songs been made about Georgia. Unfortunately for the neocons, the tune Georgia ain't singing the tune that they wanted to hear.
Yeah. So Georgia, for those of you who might confuse it with the U.S. state, is a small country in the South Caucasus, which is the area south of Russia between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It's a very hilly, mountainous area. Georgia is renowned historically for its wine. It may very well be the first wine-producing culture in the world, and its food, which, as anyone who's been to Russia knows, when real Russians celebrate, they eat Georgian food because it's much better than Russian food as a rule. So food and wine really something to miss. It's a small country, around 9 million population. There's actually a very large diaspora in Russia. More than 100,000 Georgians live there. It's had a troubled past since independence. They fell briefly into ethno-nationalist politics under the slogan "Georgia for Georgians," and there were already restive regions south of Ossetia, Abkhazia, and a few others that really didn't like the sound of the nationalist politics that followed the self-dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was some small wars. Eventually, Russian peacekeepers, a deal was reached. Russian peacekeepers were placed. And at some point in the early 2000s, there was the Rose Revolution, which was one of the first color revolutions where the U.S. helped install the neoliberal strongman Mikhail Saakashvili of "I eat my tie when I'm scared" fame. Now, he started a brief war with Russia by trying to reintegrate South Ossetia by force and attacking Russian peacekeepers in the process. Russia defeated him in it was a less than a week war in 2008. And soon after that, he was replaced internally by a rise of, shall we say, pragmatic Georgian politics. A new Georgian political party arrived on the scene called Georgia Dream. And this, said, we may not like Russia, but we're kind of have to recognize geography. We're stuck where we are. It's a great power, and countries, whether it's Mexico dealing with the U.S. or Georgia dealing with Russia, small states have to make certain accommodations when they live next to great powers, both economically and militarily for security reasons. So they still were charted on a entry into the EU and into NATO, ostensibly course, but they were less confrontational about it. While diplomatic relations have not been restored with Russia since 2008, economic relations, which, money speaks, were opened. And Georgian wine and food and Borjomi sparkling water once again found a market in Russia, which vastly helped the Georgian economy. Now, the Georgia Dream Party has more or less been in power since, and there's been a period of stability and relative economic good times, right? Maybe, not always the most equal of economic distribution, but that's the same in any capitalist country. But Georgia's charting, like last year, 5%, 5-point-something% growth, right? Georgians started to have positive views again. But there is still a very significant, rabidly pro-Western, anti-Russian opposition. It's scattered among 4 different parties, right? None of which got really more than 10% in the recent election. But they're very loud, they're very vocal, and they tried to frame the recent parliamentary election last week, as on Georgia's geopolitical orientation. We have to choose we're either with the West or we're occupied by Russia, right? That's the way they tried to frame it. And the kind of the loudest, at least the figurehead of the opposition, is the Georgian president. Now, Georgia is a parliamentary country, which means the real power is in the parliament. The president is kind of a symbolic office. But a few years ago, I really honestly don't understand how she got elected. Salome Zurabichvili. She was previously a French citizen, and she changed her citizenship to enter Georgian politics and run for president. Not only is she was she a French citizen, she was actually literally the French ambassador to Georgia. Talk about state capture. She has been, rabidly screaming about the democratic course. And the Georgian Dream government, just before the elections this last weekend, they have passed two pieces of legislation that really teed the West off. One of them is a Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is just really like the American version or the Canadian version or the French version, which were actually, the Canadian and French were just passed at the same time Georgia was passing theirs. And it simply says that NGOs and media outlets funded by foreigners, they have to label themselves as such, right? They have to label that this is lobbying, effectively by a foreign government. The U.S. does not like that, right? They have their own Foreign Agent Registration Act, and they have no problems. In fact, they just outright ban Russian media, for instance. But it's a do as we say, not as we do. The deal is every non-Western country has to make themselves and their people completely vulnerable to influence by way of money and NGOs and stuff to the West, while the West is allowed to cut off all outside information coming to their own people. Those are the rules of the game. It's the rules-based order. We make the rules, we give the orders. And the other one was a LGBTQ, quote unquote, anti-propaganda measure, which is, even more hated in the West, very popular in Orthodox Georgia, that simply says that, gay clubs, who cares what you do in your own house? That's not our business, but you're not allowed to promote a political ideology, LGBTQ, where children are around, right? That's very similar to Russian legislation on the subject. Well, those two drove the ire of the West, and right away there were sanctions tossed at the Georgian government, at the prime minister. There were threats. The EU accession process was effectively stopped. Everything came to a close, and it led Mark Miller, the U.S. State Department, to make threats, open threats to Georgia, saying, you must resume your Euro-Atlantic course, or there will be consequences, right? Said it right out like that. So the election, the results of the parliamentary election over last weekend saw the Georgia Dream reelected with a solid majority, 54%, and none of the four pro-Western opposition parties got much more than 10%, right, across the board. But right away, the pro-Western opposition has refused to recognize the results. They say there has been Russian interference in the election, right? Because Russians interfere in everything. And, when asked, what evidence do you have of this? The Georgian president, Salome Zurabichvili, said, well, we don't have any evidence. That's hard to find. The Americans claimed that the Russians were interfering in their elections, and they didn't present any evidence. So we don't have to either. What's important is we believe that there was interference. That's literally what she said, literally. So that's where it is right now. Several European governments, including Germany, have refused to recognize the results because the results weren't what they wanted, right? They're depicting this as a win for Russia. And again, the Georgia Dream Party is not pro-Russian. They're just not rabidly anti-Russian. And that's kind of the standard for the West now. All of its partners have to be rabidly anti-Russian. If you just want neutral, good relations with the West and Russia, that's not acceptable. You have to make a choice. So they've been obviously Viktor Orban, the Betnois Hungarian prime minister, who has really teed off Brussels and Washington. He made a special trip to Tbilisi right after the election. He congratulated the Georgian prime minister on his re-election, and he said outright, the West is trying to another color revolution in Georgia. Said it out just like that. He's going to end up shot. I mean, seriously, he's going to end up like Fizzo. Yeah, this further infuriated the West. But right now, there's not a lot of sign that they're gaining a lot of, there's not the Maidan energy. Supposedly, several hundred Ukrainians, some people off of the Maidan, some people involved in the Odessa massacre, some snipers, according to some reports, have appeared. But there isn't the mass crowds. They haven't been able to generate the huge crowds and the street muscle with the, Banderite, far-right, nascent militias that, were the strong arm of the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. They don't appear to have the same strength in numbers or the same kind of street far-right muscle that helped them seize power in the country. It's not a done deal yet, but right now it does not seem that they're generating that critical mass on the streets that would be necessary to overthrow the government.
Yeah, it sounds like the regime change move is not what it used to be. All right, let's get back to something that's critical that really, this is an issue. I understand that there are virtually no troops that Russia's using anymore. They have all been replaced by North Korean troops. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Russian troops have completely withdrawn from Kursk and Ukraine and everywhere. And now there's only North Korean troops. I don't know, maybe all the Russian troops ran away, they quit, and it's all North Korea now. Russia, in fact, as a state, I understand, may be completely replaced by North Korea, Mark.
It's literally Red Dawn 3. Wolverines, yeah. Right? I mean, this is the type of atmosphere that's being projected in the Western media, coming directly from the Kiev regime propaganda. There's claims of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, billions of North Korean troops. Only they're not just troops, actually. They know they're all North Korean special forces, right? The guys that break cinder blocks with their heads, right? And eat capitalist livers for breakfast. I mean, that's the type of forces that Russia is unleashing on Ukraine, according to the Western media. There's zero proof of this whatsoever. There's zero satellite photos. There's zero anything. I'm going to have to say that this story is 100% a hoax. I could be wrong, but there's no evidence to back this up. Now, I have no doubt that there are a certain number of North Korean troops in Russia. I don't know how many, a few hundred, maybe it's 1,500, 10,000 seems a little large. I have no doubt they are engaged in training and interoperability military exercises with Russia. They just signed a new strategic partnership with a mutual defense clause. They are literally treaty allies now, right? They're allowed to do that on Russian territory. We've heard several Western officials with no evidence say that North Korean troops are in Russia on the way to Kursk, right? The area where the dwindling Kiev regime's incursion into that strategic backwater of the border is. But they provide no evidence of this. And I actually seriously doubt that there's many North Korean troops there. Almost certainly, if they're anywhere, it's probably in the Far East. There is the possibility that some North Korean officers, specialists are behind the lines, logisticians, combat engineers, drone specialists, learning from what Russia is doing, right? Because this is a big deal. This is the first conflict, right? Near peer, adversaries that the world has seen really on this scale since World War II. And it's, let's be honest, it's Russia versus NATO. And, the U.S. likes to call these conflicts that, Russia is a near peer competitor. Well, I mean, okay, all right, let's be equally dismissive. Let's not refer to NATO as a peer competitor. Considering the results on the battlefield, the way that things have been going, we should say that NATO forces are a near peer competitor to Russia, right? They're close, but they're not cutting the mustard. So I have no idea. I have no doubt that North Koreans want to learn from this, right? Particularly if they have provided some weapons, some artillery shells, maybe even some ballistic missiles, as the Western media claims. Russian and North Korean governments, for what it's worth, deny it. But if they have, well, then they probably want to see how they're being used, how they work in actual combat conditions. And this is almost certainly what is being blown up by the Kiev regime and now kind of belatedly picked up by Washington, by the Pentagon, by NATO Secretary General, who are like, well, if these troops move to Kursk, that would be blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, if they did, let's assume for 1 minute that they're really there and Russia is really going to send them to Kursk inside Russia to fight the Ukrainians. That's inside Russian territory. That's actually completely internationally legal. There's a treaty between them. Now, I don't think that's the case. I don't think they're going to be engaged. There's a number of reasons for that. One, Russia and North Korea have not been doing military exercises since well before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? They have zero military interoperability. That's why they need to begin training. That's why Russia and China have been doing a new military exercise practically every month for years now to gain that. That's what NATO does all the time, particularly considering the language barrier. All right, Russians don't speak North Korean, and most North Koreans don't speak Russian, right? So to send them into this extremely complicated battlefield with no common language, with no interoperability experience working together, these North Korean troops have never seen real battle before, right? Much like many troops around the world, right. But that would be very hard. And Russia doesn't need the manpower. Even the Western governments have admitted that Russia is enlisting some 30,000 volunteer contract soldiers a month, right? 1,000 a day, right? The Russian military, we've heard it from Cavaioli, the U.S. commander, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Europe and NATO, say that the Russian army, actually, as a result of this conflict, is getting bigger and better and more experienced and stronger. And that includes manpower, right? Russia is not sending press gangs to forcibly conscript people out of gyms and nightclubs and shopping malls like the Kiev regime is. They don't need 3,000, 10,000 North Koreans. They don't. And the diplomatic damage that would be done by dragging, making this conflict more international. Russia's too smart diplomatically for this, right? There's a lot of countries in the global south that are currently quietly backing Russia that would really raise an eyebrow like this. And to be perfectly frank, Putin doesn't want to give Brazil and India any more excuses to raise any more eyebrows, right? They've got enough. So I think this whole thing is a hoax. It's 99% propaganda. And the purposes of that are so the Zelensky regimes can say, look, Russia's bringing in North Korea. NATO troops should fight directly in uniform in Ukraine. We need the long-range strike capability that you keep denying us with your weapons, i.e. NATO needs to conduct long-range missile strikes in Russia. Because those North Koreans, they're just behind our missile range, conveniently. But if we had the long-range strikes, we could hit them. And probably they're also hoping to get more support from South Korea. South Korea has already provided hundreds of thousands of artillery shells for the Kiev regime through a quick deal through the U.S., where I don't even know if they were actually in the U.S. in any period before they were sent over. That's actually what was used during the Kiev regime's failed 2003 summer offensive. Those were South Korean artillery shells. So they're probably looking for more South Korean military equipment, more South Korean munitions. That's the whole purpose of this, as far as I can see. Some type of completely hoax escalation. And the Russian government and the North Korean government have both denied this. There's been some coy comments by Putin, basically saying that, well, if we wanted to, if we really wanted to do that, we would have every right to do it, at least in Kursk, right? Or, whatever, considering how many NATO specialist forces and special forces we all know are operating on the ground in Ukraine, as numerous Western politicians have admitted.
Kursk, period. Yeah, I agree with you. There's nothing you said there that I disagree with. I'm with you on all of that. Kursk itself, that was going to be the big one. They're going to go in there, and they're going to show the Ruskies this time. They're going to go to their home turf. They're going to take nuclear power plants. They're going to take nuclear sites with nuclear weapons. Man, this is going to be big. It didn't turn out real well, Mark. It didn't turn out well at all. Talk about now, certainly terrible things have happened. They've killed and kidnapped and raped. I mean, they've done crimes against humanity against Russian civilians, but their overall plan of taking part of Russia and doing all kinds of nuclear related things seems to have come to a screeching halt at the loss of a whole hell of a lot of soldiers. That, in fact, I would argue this. A lot of the things that are falling along the contact line, a big part of why it's going so fast, it would have went anyway, but they used up all of their reserves and just made it all the quicker.
Yeah, not just manpower. Manpower is very important, because they pulled manpower away from these already collapsing defensive lines in the south and central Donbas to send to Kursk, right? They made all these claims that.
How much? Did we ever get any real numbers or any figures of how many people actually that were involved in that Kursk operation?
Yeah, from their side, even when it began, there was close to 60,000. Right?
Wow.
Not all of them. Not all of them were actually in Kursk.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of were behind the lines.
Right.
In the Ukrainian side of the border, but they're an essential part of any military operation, right? Actually, it's a very small number of troops that actually, generally fight on the front lines. But yeah, there was a big diversion of forces. Some of them were new forced conscripts, but a considerable number of them were experienced troops that were pulled off of Pokrovsk and Deterrence and Chasiv Yar and everywhere else. And they made these claims as if Russia would have to. They said Russia would have to pull troops away from the Donbas, particularly from the Pokrovsk offensive, in order to stop this. And Russia didn't have to do that. Why? Because Russia has enough manpower. They had enough reserves. They were able to pull them out of a few other locations out of the Donbas, but mostly reserves that had not yet been committed to the special military operation in Ukraine. So they didn't need to. And the Kiev regime also lost, perhaps even more importantly, a huge amount of Western equipment that at this point can't be replaced, right? We're talking more. I don't have a final count at hand, but at least 5 HIMARS systems, perhaps more, right? They lost multiple expensive Western Patriot systems, the Iris-T, the German systems. They lost a French air defense system there. They lost, and now Russia has essentially unquestioned air superiority and strike capability pretty much everywhere in Ukraine because the Kiev regime has no air defense left. Essentially, everything that the West sent, most of it is gone, right? And a considerable portion of it was destroyed in Kursk. But they've also lost large numbers of tanks. They've lost some electronic warfare equipment, APCs. In fact, there's lots of reports about them in the Kursk region now being reduced to using civilian vehicles to get their forces around and to pull them back out as part of medevac and stuff because they have no military vehicles left, not even APCs and infantry fighting vehicles. So, yeah, I mean, I hope they enjoyed that very brief and very limited tactical success. They had its big info war celebration across the Western media. Yeah, stick it to the Russians. Putin is humiliated. Well, I hope they got what they needed out of that because humiliation doesn't win wars. And more than 50% of the original Kursk incursion territory has already been taken back by Russia. And even the Western media is admitting now that it has denuded these defensive positions in the Donbas, particularly in the South Donbas, of troops and equipment. And Russia would have, their advances would have been much slower and more difficult if those troops, instead of being out in the open in podunk villages, right, of no strategic value, with no fortifications, no defenses, very small urban areas, if they had been instead in the east, in these tight urban areas and with built-up fortifications, they would have been much more effective. So, while there has been an undeniable loss of Russian civilian life in the Kursk region, not huge, but any amount, hundreds we're talking, that is a tragedy. By and large, the Kiev regime has just shot itself, right? It's, you want to say in the foot, or as Orban put it, shot itself in the lungs with this Kursk incursion. It has cost them badly. It has been a huge strategic blunder of monumental proportions in hindsight. And even the Western mainstream media is very belatingly, very grudgingly admitting this now.
Let me ask you this. That being said, I can't keep up with the daily towns falling. No, not that I can pronounce any of them. Not that I can pronounce any of them. But Solidovo, I'm pretty good with that. But when you start to get into the words that are like yeah, that's when I get lost, right? But it seems to me that very, very important that this thing is really going south for the or west, as it were, for the Kiev regime, and not the least of which being because of the language that I'm hearing. I heard last week someone in Poland said, we're going to have a modus vivendi with the, after this thing's over with the really the Poles.
Oh, they pulled out the Latin. They pulled out the Latin.
Exactly. You guys are like, we eat Russians for lunch, but perhaps maybe now we need to be friends. We're hearing things like that. Gerhard Schroeder is now no longer cast out into the land of evil Russian lovers. There are people in Germany saying perhaps we should let people who have been giving us reasonable advice about how to deal with this, perhaps we should let them back in the circle. Things ain't going so well. That's all I'm trying to say, Mark. What do we know about the contact line? As I said, you can't keep up with the towns that are falling, with the, what do they call them, cauldrons forming. Mark.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the really hot area right now is the South Donbas. After the fall of Ugledar, which was really quickly, the Kiev regime's defenses have collapsed in South Donbas. And you know me, I have never used the word collapse before, right? I've talked about, retreats, withdrawals, defeats, but we're actually seeing the first real collapse of Kiev regime forces. It's still localized to the South Donbas, but they're not even able to slow Russian forces down now. Russian forces are right now, their only real limitation is their own logistics and consolidating territory. So you're right, 3-4 settlements a day, right, are being moved up. Selidova was taken in final result very quickly. Karahava, another one of these important logistics centers that was once behind the defensive lines, is in operational encirclement right now and is facing potential full encirclement, being physically cut off as well. And everything is tightening further on Pokrovsk. Right now, in the South Donbas, Russia is using 3 armies at the same time, right? You've got the center forces, the south forces, and the east forces, and they're all cooperating together. I remember all these Western analysts like Michael Kaufman at CNAS, who have been saying all along in this conflict that Russia can't operate, with more than a brigade-style offensive at the same time. They're using 3 armies at the same time right now. There's nothing that can stop Russian forces, it appears, in the South Donbas. And I really expect, aside from Pokrovsk, everything should be wrapped up by the end of this year in the South Donbas. Pokrovsk will probably be under siege by then. Eventually, it will be taken, and it won't last near as long as Bakhmut or Avdiivka. It will fall very quickly because they don't have the type of built-up defenses there. And with the entire surrounding region, they're just, it's a boa constrictor because they're just cutting off everything all around it. They're moving in, and then by probably next spring, Russian forces will be moving on the last defensive line in the Donbas, which is the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka line. It will be almost assuredly wrapped up or nearly wrapped up by the middle of next year. But more importantly, these forces, once Pokrovsk is taken here in the South Donbas, a good portion of that force is not going to be sent north to deal with that last defensive line. Instead, it's widely discussed they're going to be sent west, because west of Pokrovsk is operational space. Here is the start of the Ukrainian steppe. There's no more hills. There's no more tight urban agglomerations, no more coal mines and slag heaps and fortifications and defensive lines that have characterized this long, grueling war of attrition in the Donbas. It's just flat, open plains with tiny little undefendable settlements all the way to the banks of the Dnieper River, right? So Russia forces are going to cut into the Zaporozhye and Dnieper regions from the west. And there's a lot of talk that Russia may begin in the coming months a new offensive, an offensive of their own, coming from the south up into Zaporozhye region as well. So they may be sending troops from the east and from the south at the same time, probably at the start of next year. And you're going to see, I think what we're going to see is Russia is going to start to transition, at least in this area, away from the strategy, tactics of a war of attrition, and towards the strategy and tactics of maneuver warfare, simply because they've attrited the Kiev regime's military to the point where that is possible without any real serious losses from the Russian side?
Well, I think a lot of that will be dictated by Russia's industrial shovel capacity, because otherwise they won't have anything to fight with. We understood 3 months into the war, they ran out of missiles, and then they began. Of course, I guess they were out of shell rounds too, so they started fighting with shovels. But that seems to be going well. All right. There's something else I wanted to ask you about that, and that is, okay. We've talked about Kamala's, I've talked about her incoherent babbling, and Trump is, one day he's cooking fries, the next day he's in a garbage truck. I think it's hilarious. I think
American political theater.
Exactly.
It never ceases to be amusing to me the way Americans can get so passionate, insisting that Coke is better than Pepsi or Pepsi is better than Coke. They're so sincere about it. Like they believe it actually makes a difference. It's so cute.
And if you look into that history, that was actually a conspiracy between Coke and Pepsi. They worked together on that because what they wanted to create a dynamic where people said, do you want Coke or Pepsi? Not Shasta, not anything else. So as long as you're choosing between Coke and Pepsi, they went, which kind of reminds me of the uniparty, kind of same dynamic at any rate. Although I think things are interesting. At that Kamala Harris, boy, the interesting creature. But here's my point. Out of all of that, not Trump, he's not gonna go to the Kremlin with a pack of large fries or ask if he can empty their garbage.
You've seen the videos of Trump serving at McDonald's out the drive-through window?
Oh,
have you seen the meme they did in AI where Putin and Kim Jong-un drive up to the drive-through and get served by Trump?
Oh, I bet that's hilarious. I gotta find that. So at any rate, so here we are. The old fry cook is saying that, look, man, I want out. J.D. Vance is saying, we got to now. That being, certainly, let's just say their plans have a few holes in them. But Biden, we now know, forbid anyone in his administration from talking to Putin or President Putin or Sergei Lavrov. It was like, no, whatever we do, we don't want to talk to the Russians and try to end this thing because, hey, we did say to the last Ukrainian, and there's a few left, right? That seems to be their position. We got a few Ukrainians. We're not quite out of Ukrainians, and we'll keep going till we run out, right? Sadly. But here's my point. Your thoughts, if there is a genuine feeling, and I know at times the Russian leadership can piss off the Russian people because they're like, no, let's smash them. And the Russian leadership can be like, yeah, well, maybe we'll work out a deal that you guys might not quite not. You know where I'm getting at. Your thoughts on Vance and Trump, if they win, wanting a deal, but I don't see how they can do it because the Russians don't need a deal. I put it like this. If my opponent is laying on the ground and I'm pummeling him mercilessly, he needs a deal. I don't. You know what I'm saying? His deal, the only deal I'll take is unconditional surrender. At any rate, I throw all that at you, Mark. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's extremely pertinent. So the Russian government the official position is it doesn't make any difference who wins the election, that the U.S. president has very limited power to actually affect foreign policy and military, that the real decisions are made by, the Ben Rhodes called it the blob, if you want to call it the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, and inevitably U.S. presidents, as during the previous Trump administration, where he talked a good game about good relations with Russia and then hired a bunch of neocons, Mike Pompeo and John Bolton to run his foreign policy, and then it was the worst it had been up until that point. So the Russian position is that nothing is going to change. You're right. Russia is winning on the battlefield. And we've seen several of these plans tossed around in the Western media by Trump proxies, and none of these will be acceptable to Russia. And they're essentially, they're going to try to award Russia with what they've already gotten and what they've already taken and but not officially. Like, yeah, but we'll try to take it back in a few years, right? That's not going to fly. That's not going to fly at all. So Russia is, there will be some type of diplomatic settlement eventually, but I don't think we're anywhere close to there yet, right? As you said,
one quick thing, Trump on Joe Rogan said, "What is your plan?" And Trump said then, I think it was the only time he was honest. He says, "I can't tell you that." He says, "I want to get a deal. I'll get a deal." Trump, "I'll get a deal." He says, "But if I told you, I wouldn't be able to get the deal." And I think that is an indication. Again, we got the blob, we got everything else, but I think there is an indication, if nothing else, out of his narcissism. Trump wants to be the guy that say, "Nobody could get a deal, but I'm Trump. And I told him," Trump, Trump, he wants a deal because he's Trump. But at any rate, do you think
he's actually said that if Putin doesn't accept his deal, that he threatened to flood Ukraine with weapons, and which just makes me laugh. With what weapons? If Biden could find any more weapons that the Kiev regime could use, that he could give him, effectively, he would have already given them. But Trump has at other places admitted the U.S. is out of artillery shells. They're out of air defense interceptor missiles. They're out of key munitions and equipment that the Kiev regime would need even to hold their own in this conflict. So he can't flood them with anything. He's also at other times.
I think that's BS. That's Trump BS and bravado. You know what I mean? You got to.
He's also threatened to bomb Moscow, right? He said the Russian government is not going to take this clown seriously. I'm afraid, right? Maybe he's more serious in person, but they're in the driver's seat. There's no reason for them to accept some deal from the United States simply because Trump got elected, and they should accept some half measure that would see this war refought again in 4 to 5 years. And you're right. I think the Russian people would be furious if there is not a very substantial victory after all of the effort and the blood that has been shed so far. There's this constant refrain, no more Minsk, right? No more Minsk agreements that the West can walk out on that would leave the problem of the Kiev regime in Ukraine unfulfilled. I think that this will not be ended until this regime is rooted out, root and branch from Kiev. Even then, it won't be completely over. But unfortunately, I think that this is going to be probably continued, right? The conflict, obviously the Western support is going to decrease, whoever is elected. They simply can't provide anymore, right? It's not a matter of political will. It's not a matter of money. U.S. can always print more money. We know that, right? We've seen $36 trillion testimony to that. It's simply the U.S. military industrial complex is not geared up to fight this type of war, and they can't ramp it up fast enough to compete with Russia. So they can continue it at a lower level.
They got 2 wars, not just
2.
one.
Yeah. All right. Supposedly China is more important to them, right? And they want to start a war there while they believe they can still win it. Yeah, right. Okay. And
while the Iranians, they can't touch the Iranians. I mean, right now they're looking, things ain't looking all that good for the U.S. arms race. I'll just say that.
Yes. Yeah. I think there is growing evidence, one, that Iran's strike was much more effective than was initially admitted. And 2, it's starting to look like that Israel's counterstrike was much less effective than was initially propagandized in the Western media. And if you add those 2 things together, we are seeing a major shift in the military balance in the Middle East that is getting very hard to deny now.
One question I do have to ask you, from since you're in Moscow, because I got to get your perspective, and that is the discussion about the Iran strike, right? And I want to get your perspective on that. Various discussions. What the one that's starting to prevail is basically the Israelis tried and were thwarted, right? But then that question goes to this: were they thwarted because of the Iranians' technological capabilities, or did the Russians come in with S-400s and all this advanced Russian technology, which we were led to believe was only shovels? But whatever it is, it's either the Iranians are technically, really technologically have become pretty advanced, right? Which they don't want to admit that. They'll at least try to say, no, the Russians came in with all kinds of S-400 and stuff. And that's the reason that the F-35s and all couldn't come in. Is there some truth to a little bit of all of that? Anyway, Mark, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it really ends up somewhere in the middle. First of all, Iran's military has been dramatically underestimated by Israel and the West, much like Russia's military was, by the way. And I don't think anyone has a question that the Russian military is a scale up above the Iranian military, right?
Order of magnitude.
Order of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't scoff at Iran's indigenous air defense systems, right? They've learned over time. Russia already years ago provided them with the S-300 system, which was integrated, and they learned a lot from that to help develop their own indigenous air defense systems. There's a lot of talk that in the Western media that Russia, in the last 2 months has provided Iran with S-400 air defense systems, perhaps with other shorter range, but actually probably even more important air defense systems like the Pantsir, like the Tor system, very, very advanced short, medium range Russian air defense systems that operate as part of an integrated air defense network. There's also talk that Russia provided them with a very powerful, Russia's probably most powerful electronic warfare complex, the Murmansk BN, which plays a very can play a very heavy role in air defense, actually, right? It's a shield in the electromagnetic spectrum that can cut off GPS signals, that can cut off communications between planes, between missiles, really powerful system. Russia and Iran, for what it's said, both deny that, right? But they would. So we don't know. I suspect that Russia probably did assist them, even if it was only with satellite intelligence, right? C4ISR, Russia's powerful radars in the south would have, and Russia has radars in Syria, by the way, right? At the Hmeimim Air Base, right? Yeah, they could have provided them with a lot of information that could have helped them formulate a defense, just intelligence-wise, right? Even in the Ukraine conflict, it's often underestimated how much value providing all that satellite information to the Kiev regime in Ukraine has been to them being able to hold out in the conflict as long as they have. Intelligence, satellite information, radar, these are all very important things in modern warfare. So by and large, I think that Russia probably provided the icing on the cake to the Iranian defense. They might have helped, cover it over, help tie it together, but I would not. I think there has been a general underestimation of how effective the Iranian air defense system has been on its own, which is not to say that they took down everything from Israel out of the sky or anything like that, but that they performed much better in relative terms than the West expected.
And of course, Israel, what we have now is Israel. And to me, it's represented. This is this to me were proxy aerial attacks, right? The U.S. did everything, brought in, pulled out every stop they could to stop the Iranian attack on Israel, to no avail. It's now clear if the Iranians, they can hit Israel anytime they want to, right? And it certainly, in listening and following a number of people who I have a lot of respect for, such as Alistair Crook, it certainly appears as though we're going to do the usual. We've heard it all along. You go in, you suppress the air defense, then you come in with other waves and you attack various targets. According to Alistair Crook and others, they came in and the first attack in the old air defense systems didn't work, and they had to call off the rest, that there were F-35s, et cetera, that were locked on, that basically...
I've heard that as well.
Yeah, anyway,
Yeah,
do you think there's any... Do you give any credibility to those kinds of discussions, or do you even know?
Okay, so Alistair Crook is to be taken seriously whenever he speaks about something, right? I mean, he's been an ambassador. He knows people on both sides. He speaks the local languages. He's very knowledgeable and formidable. I can't say that, what he's saying is 100% correct, but it does make a great deal of sense, right? We know that they cannot have performed any type of effective seed or suppression of enemy air defense operations because there were no Israeli airplanes that even penetrated Iranian airspace. And right, these type of radar homing missiles that are used to take out air defense systems, they're just not long range, right? You have to get in close. I mean, that's the whole lessons of the Vietnam War and the wild weasels and everything. These things are very complicated. This is why Russia's Air Force was very, had a very limited role for the first 2 years of the conflict in Ukraine, because they had to eliminate the Kiev regime's very effective integrated Soviet legacy air defense system from afar with long-range strike over a year and a half to 2 years, right? And only now does Russia have, and then the Western air defenses had to be eliminated as well. So I think this is very credible without, saying that it is absolutely true. And what these two conflicts have now exposed that should be glaringly obvious, both from the failures in Ukraine and the recent failures to provide effective air defense system in Israel, is that air defense is the U.S. military and the Western military's Achilles heel. It's very poor in relation to what Russia have and what presumably China has, and even right, we can now start to talk about Iranian air defense, however much help they got or didn't have. And if the U.S. can't provide air defense for their allies or for their own forces, how do they think they're going to take on China in the Taiwan Straits and off the South China Sea at the absolutely ridiculously minuscule amount of air defense interceptor missiles, Patriots, THAADs, Aegis ashore, or Aegis afloat that they are making a year? The U.S. military industrial complex, RAND Corporation, just put out a major screaming alarm report. The U.S. military industrial complex is not up to the task. And what they effectively said is that it needs to become a national unity and focused military industrial complex like the Russians have. That's effectively what RAND said. And they're screaming that it was necessary to start doing this yesterday, right? And one of the biggest concerns is air defense interceptor missiles. And it must be said, air defense systems as a whole. And the U.S. did not concentrate on this all through the end of the Cold War and the last 30 years, because they believed they would always have air superiority over any given conflict. Russia, and to a lesser extent, China and Iran, recognizing the West's focus on air power and projection, they focused on effective counters to that, which is the air defense and the electronic warfare. which is now today why Russia has the best air defense and electronic warfare in the world. And the US is really hurting. And their strategy in that regard of what to develop and what not now looks like a big decades-long mistake for not properly investing in air defense like the Russians did.
Yeah, the last part of it is this. And their strategy now won't work. Okay, we need to make fill in the blank, right? We need to change things so we can make missiles, whatever the case may be. There's foundational things you need. You got to have steel mills. You know what I mean? I mean, there's certain things you got to make gunpowder. We ain't making much gunpowder these days. You know what I mean?
Even the type of cotton that they use in artillery shells.
Gun
the
cotton.
Biggest source of it in the world is in the Uyghur region of China, which the U.S. has leveled sanctions on as part of their genocide hoax for propaganda reasons against China. Way to shoot yourself in the foot again.
Yeah, they don't. And so we don't. Here's my point. It comes out over and over again. Neoliberalism has hollowed out the industrial capacity of the West completely. And ultimately, war making comes down to industrial capacity. And we don't have it. And we have a system that not only has killed it, but makes sure it's not coming back, and it can't come back. So they're saying we should do something that we can't do. You know, Garland, you should practice 100-yard sprints every day. I got a bad back. I can't sprint, I can't sprint 100 centimeters. Yeah, if you would just do 100-yard sprints, you'd be great. Yeah, that's not going to happen. I don't have the foundational things that I need in my back, like pads between the vertebrae to make that happen. So we don't have the foundation, the commodity, the economic. Might I add this? You got to have people who are trained. You got to have an educated workforce, and their educational system is shot.
It's all the STEM graduates in U.S. schools. They're all immigrants from India and previously from China and everywhere else. Seriously, go to any STEM, program in any major university in the U.S. Most of the students and 70-80% of the teachers are all foreigners.
It's interesting that Trump, the two jobs that Trump was doing recently was a fry cook and a garbage man. Those are the only jobs left in the United States. You can cook fries or you can deliver garbage or something like that. Other than that, there ain't a whole lot for you to do. Mark,
Spin Master. You forgot Spin Master. There's plenty of room for that yet.
That's a big one. Mark, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter, X, at Mark Sloboda 1. But follow me on Substack and Telegram at the
While most Western countries are distracted with the upcoming U.S. election, the BRICS 2024 summit took place last week and is going to change the entire future of geopolitics. Now, don't get me wrong, the U.S. election is important, but as political commentator Glenn Greenwald states, the U.S. has no functional president and has not had one for months, and it's barely noticeable. And barely matters because there's a permanent unelected machine that runs the government. There's a lot of truth to that statement, and countries around the world are planning a new path. The 2024 BRICS Summit was the most successful meeting in BRICS history, as this meeting further propelled the rapidly occurring seismic shift in the world order towards the Global South countries. Some have even compared this meeting to that of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that established the current US-led Western world order. Nothing better embodies this shift in power away from the West than the location of the conference itself. When Russia pushed back against NATO expansion in Ukraine 2 years ago, the West has done everything in its power to isolate Russia on the world stage and collapse its economy. Despite complete condemnation from the US and EU, Russia has been able to host some of the most prominent and influential leaders in the world. They also have an economy that is set to grow faster than all the advanced economies threatening them. This is a major red flag for Western countries moving forward, as the use of economic sanctions is no longer effective. 15 years ago, there was no alternative for developing countries. Your only option was to work with Western institutions that heavily favored the US and its allies. But all of this has changed with the rise of China, the formation of BRICS, and the shift to the multipolar world we now live in. In today's video, we're going to break down the 3 major developments from the BRICS 2024 Summit and show you exactly how it's going to change our world. The 2024 BRICS Summit was important as it marked the first since the admission of Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Alongside Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, these nations formed the voting bloc within the alliance. With the success of the original partnership, paired with growing U.S. instability, the floodgates have opened for countries seeking to join BRICS. 18 states have officially applied for membership. These applicants include key global players, from Venezuela's oil reserves and Malaysia's strategic positioning to NATO's Turkey membership and Palestine's influence, each delivering significant blows to the West's hegemony. There are also a further 13 influential countries who have become partner states, allowing them to participate in BRICS without any voting power. The core members, their partners, and future additions all but ensure that BRICS will become a dominant force that is already in many ways superior to the G7. As the Carnegie Institute reports, BRICS Plus is a formidable economic bloc comprising half of the world's population, 40% of its trade, and 40% of crude oil production and exports. So how has the West responded to the rise of such a strong organization? Unsurprisingly, with a typical Western superiority complex. Representing the worst of these attitudes was the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who was quoted saying, "BRICS is a very obscure, disordered clique. Don't take it too seriously. It includes India and China, so what could ever come out of this?" It's quite the bold statement, and of course this didn't age well. It's the same type of Western arrogance that has resulted in China leapfrogging the US the past 15 years to now dominate almost every aspect of modern technology. Ironically, during the summit, China and India reached a historic settlement, ending hostilities along their border and vowing to strengthen their friendship through BRICS. In addition, with the presence of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam in this partner category, it implies that BRICS, already dominant in Asia due to China and India's membership, will become the leading power in this region. Of course, if you listen to Western media, you'll hear a message that BRICS is an organization that is anti-West. But this claim is too simplistic and untrue. Just take it from the words of the former Egyptian foreign minister.
Why is it when we do something, it's considered to be anti-West? We're not looking for an anti-anybody group. We're trying to work together as much as we can and to ensure that we and others have multiple options.
China's president echoed the same sentiment in his opening statement. BRICS is not an exercise of asking countries to take sides, nor an exercise of creating bloc confrontation. Rather, it is an endeavor to expand the architecture of peace and development. One of the reasons the BRICS alliance is growing so fast is, ironically, the actions of the US government. 1/3 of the world is currently under US sanctions, 60% of whom are global South countries. The West has essentially forced these countries to seek an alternative path. In a speech during the BRICS Summit, Vladimir Putin called out the weaponization of the US dollar, saying it was a strategic mistake that undermines trust in the dollar as a global currency. He made it clear that Russia didn't willingly abandon the dollar or choose to fight against it. Instead, they were blocked from using it due to sanctions. As a result, Russia had no choice but to explore alternative financial systems and currencies to protect its economy. The movement towards global de-Westernization is accelerating, and in the long term, it's going to heavily influence the future of the US dollar. I'm going to break down exactly how BRICS will change the US dollar status as the global reserve currency. But first, I want to tell you about today's video sponsor, Kalshi, which is the first legal exchange where you can bet on any event, including but not limited to elections. The platform was invented by 2 MIT engineers, and I really love it because I know most of you who watch this channel are investors, and this is a legal platform where you can bet on real events in the market. For example, Do you think the Fed will cut rates at its November 7th meeting? Over 85% of people are betting they will be cut by 25 basis points. How many deliveries will Tesla deliver this quarter? 88% of people feel it's going to be over 470,000. Or what about the price of Bitcoin this year? Most people are again bullish to see it peak over 75,000. The most popular bet right now is, of course, the US election. And according to bettors, 61% feel that Trump is going to win. A $100 bet for Trump winning would be worth $161, while a $100 bet for Kamala could win you $256. Kalshi is already being used by hundreds of thousands of people and has facilitated over $1 billion worth of trade. Simply go to kalshi.com/Cyrus Jansen, and the first 500 traders who deposit $100 will get a free $20 credit. To learn more, simply click the link down below. But now let's take a look at the biggest announcement of the BRICS Summit and show you exactly how it will change the entire global financial system in the future and heavily influence the role of the US dollar. Up until now, when making payments across borders, countries must utilize the Western-led SWIFT system and use the dollar as an intermediary currency in all transactions. This is why the US dollar is the world's global reserve currency. Every country needs dollars to send international payments around the world. But of course, there is a major risk, as the US government has been steadily increasing economic sanctions every year. If your country does not fall in line with the US government, you will be cut off from the SWIFT network. There is no greater example of this than the sanctions imposed on Russia, and the US government restricting thousands of Russian banks from accessing SWIFT. But all of this will change with the creation of BRICS Clear, a settlement and clearing system for trade between BRICS members and the new partner countries. Transaction clearing will be handled through a stablecoin, which will be managed by the new developmental bank and serve as the unit of account, with final settlements occurring in local currencies. Headquartered in Shanghai, the NDB is an alternative to the US and EU-dominated IMF and World Bank, and is already having a profound impact on the developing world. By the end of 2023, the new development bank has already approved over 105 projects worth approximately $35 billion US. What's most interesting about the launch of BRICS Clear is that the system draws inspiration from the European Payments Union, which was operated between 1950 and 1958. At that time, transaction calculations and final settlement were done in US dollars. Now, for years, there have been rumors that BRICS would create a brand new currency, backed by gold, to de-dollarize around the world. But this year's summit confirmed that this indeed will not happen. Instead, BRICS will embrace blockchain technology and create a stablecoin that will serve as a unit of measure in all transactions, and then settle all transactions in the respective local currency. The reason for this is simple. BRICS is a unique and diverse organization with members spread around the globe. The use of local currencies in trade will improve each country's own economy and also increase stability for each country's respective currency. But sending money overseas and conducting trade in multiple local currencies is complicated and will also require the use of an insurance company. It was also announced during this year's summit that BRICS will create its own BRICS reinsurance company, once again further reducing dependence on the West. This is actually a major development because it will directly result in a huge loss of revenue for Western insurance and reinsurance companies specializing in trade insurance. With the creation of BRICS Clear and the new BRICS reinsurance company, this means that around 30% of global trade, currently conducted in dollars and euros, could gradually be transformed within the BRICS Clear framework and trade independently of both the US dollar and the euro. Jacques Sapir, a renowned French economist who is one of the foremost Western experts on the Russian economy, stated, "If we estimate that the currency share in central bank reserves roughly reflects these currencies' use in trade, the dollar share could decline from 58% of total identified reserves to around 35 to 40%. Wow, this is a major deal and an incredible prediction for the US dollar's future. If we look at historical data, we can clearly see the US dollar's decline as a global reserve currency. In 1999, approximately 71% of global currency reserves were held in US dollar. But fast forward to today, and that number is less than 58%. With the launch of BRICS Clear, and a new pathway for more countries around the world to use their own local currencies in foreign trade, it's almost certain to see the US dollar share of the global reserve currency continue to decline in the future. But honestly speaking, with the US government's increasing economic sanctions every year, it was only a matter of time before more countries around the world rose up and made a change. BRICS countries have an incredible amount of natural resources, and with that comes an incredible amount of leverage. Remember earlier in the video when I stated that BRICS already controls 40% of crude oil production and exports? Well, BRICS is going to double down on its position of strength and introduce a new BRICS grain exchange to trade commodities like grain, oil, natural gas, and gold, which can likewise be used to settle trade imbalances. To be honest, it's a brilliant move, as BRICS in the global south are some of the largest producers of food in the world and commodities. But what I want you to take away from this video is that the 2024 BRICS Summit marks a watershed moment in the shifting global order. Gone are the days where developing countries could only partner with the US and Western financial institutions for their future. We now live in a multipolar world, and BRICS is already a dominant player, representing more than 33% of global GDP compared to the G7's 29%. Although the alliance was initially centered on economic concerns, it has increasingly been viewed as a powerful force for addressing diplomatic issues that have long been neglected by Western-led institutions. As mentioned earlier, China and India were able to resolve their long-standing border disputes after years of tensions that had strained their relationship and the BRICS bloc as a whole. Now they have pledged to strengthen their ties and move forward together. Similarly, Russia, Turkey, and Syria have come together to resolve their differences. Armenia and Azerbaijan have opened a dialogue after years of hostilities, and the entire BRICS organization, and the majority of the world for that matter, have come together to challenge Israel and call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. BRICS also unanimously expressed support for Palestine's full-fledged membership in the United Nations. This support is critical, as the current Western-led world order is not concerned with the lives of the Palestinians and is actively enabling this crisis to continue. The BRICS organization is simply voicing the opinion of the global majority, who support an independent Palestinian state. 15 years ago, countries had little choice but to align with Western institutions that largely served the interest of the US government. Today, however, BRICS offers a compelling alternative, with new members and partners eager to join its ranks. This shift demonstrates that the world is now firmly multipolar. The developments at this summit underscore the growing power of the global south and signal that the era of unquestioned Western dominance is finally drawing to a close. Everyone, I want to thank you for spending time with me today here on YouTube. And once again, thank you to Kalshi for sponsoring.
The U.S. foreign policy has been quite obnoxious. Dozens and dozens of regime change operations, wars of choice, nonstop, CIA-led efforts to topple regimes around the world. The more you know, and by now I know a lot, it's deeply unpleasant, and it doesn't work.
Professor Sachs, you are an economist. I know you do a lot of work at the United Nations around sustainability. I wanted to ask your opinion and reaction to what has been a momentous BRICS summit thus far, which began October 22nd and is ending October 24th. I wanted to ask you about specifically, there has been a lot of news coming out of this summit in regards to partner countries joining up, 13 more, all from the global south. There has been a BRICS Pay demo, as well as a symbolic gesture of a BRICS currency being unveiled, and a lot of talk about reforming the financial system, the world financial system, and a lot of talk in the Western media about how Putin is not so isolated. There's been a lot of, from Bloomberg to BBC, talking about Vladimir Putin's presidency of the BRICS this year, showing how all these measures against Russia taken by the West have been failing. What have been your thoughts about this BRICS summit and where it is taking the world, geopolitics, and in particular, this question of Russia being isolated?
Well, maybe it's a good place to start with the West, so-called. What do we mean by the West? It's not exactly a geographical description. It means essentially the U.S.-led alliance in the world, mainly a military alliance, but also, of course, an economic alliance of sorts. And the West is the United States and Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and a handful of other countries. And when you add it up, it's not a lot of the world. As I've mentioned, 27 EU countries, Canada and the United States makes 29, Britain makes 30, Japan, Korea, 32, Australia, New Zealand makes 34. Throw in another 6 or so, you could throw in another 10 tiny island economies around the world that are, for one reason or another, tied to the U.S. or even in formal ways, like Micronesia. But when you add up the population, the U.S. is 335 million people, the EU 450 million people. That's 800 million. Add in the rest, and maybe you're at 1.1 or 1.2 billion people in the West. And that is in an 8 billion person world, about 15% of the world population. So where are the rest of the people? Well, of course, China and India, that's 2.8 billion right there. Africa, another 1.4 billion, that's 4.2 billion. So the African Union plus India plus China is more than half the world. And they're not part of the West. And when you then add in the rest of the developing world, the ASEAN countries, for example, 10 countries in Southeast Asia with a population of about 800 million people, the Central Asian countries, the West Asian countries, which are basically the Arab countries of the Middle East, plus Iran and a few others. Well, this is where the other 85% of the world ends up being, and they're not part of the Western world. There has been, of course, a certain hubris of the West for a long time. I'd say it's at least 200 years old that the West runs the world. That's coming to an end because not only do the population numbers not add up, but the GDP numbers don't add up either anymore. If you measure GDP, as I think is appropriate in many contexts, by what we call purchasing power adjusted dollars, China is already 25 or 30% larger than the United States economy in the aggregate, not per person because it's 4 times the population, but in the aggregate. So now I can turn to the BRICS. The BRICS is 9 or 10 countries right now. There's a little bit of ambiguity, in my mind at least, of exactly where Saudi Arabia is in this situation, but they're going to add more. And in the meeting today, that was a head of state, mainly roundtable discussion, there were 36 countries around the table. Those 36 countries, I added it up just earlier, was 57% of the world population just at the table. Measured in purchasing power prices, it was 46% of world output at the table. In other words, this is really a very significant part of the world. It's a larger part of the world than the Western world, in fact. Now, the West has believed that it dominates, and within the West, the United States believes it dominates because of its dominant military power, which is no doubt very strong. But what we see on the battlefield in Ukraine shows that it's not so dominant. Russia is actually, of course, defeating Ukraine on the battlefield. I say, of course, because it was completely predictable. The numbers are on Russia's side when it comes to military forces, not a surprise. But the NATO countries, and led by the United States, have poured in a lot, tens of billions of dollars of very sophisticated armaments, but nothing that was in the slightest decisive in defeating Russia. So this idea that the West even if it doesn't dominate in population numbers or in GDP shares anymore, it still dominates in military power. Not so true. And we're seeing also with Israel and its mass destructive power, no doubt, in Gaza and in Lebanon. But Israel's not defeating even Hamas. It's not defeating Hezbollah. It certainly is not going to win a direct war with Iran, where the population is more than 10 times larger, and Iran is a very sophisticated military power with the ballistic missiles, with the hypersonic missiles, and with a strong alliance with Russia. So all of this shows that we arrived before our eyes at a different world in the last 10 years. And it's happening right now. And the BRICS is this story, that the dominance of the West, which it's a little hard to date precisely. It's at least, of course, been since 1800. Arguably, it's been since 1700, because from 1700 onward, the West won all the wars that it was in with the rest of the world, by not all of them, but by and large, it was able to take territory, win colonies, and so forth until after World War II. And the West has felt, well, this is a Western-led world. That's over. And the BRICS is a vivid sign of it being over.
Yes, of course. And all those points are definitely well taken, Professor Sachs. And one thing I wanted to ask you about is how did we exactly get here, especially in recent years? Because at the summit, the BRICS countries weren't really talking about Ukraine. They weren't talking about, there was, of course, mention of Ukraine very sparingly. There was also, of course, statements made about what's happening in Gaza and West Asia. But at the same time, there was a lot more talk about development, about trade, and about how, especially in the case of these countries like Iran, like Russia and China, how all of these countries that were at the table are going to work together for a more prosperous and multipolar world. Putin and Xi Jinping met on the sidelines. Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi met on the sidelines, and they struck a historic deal on the border tensions that they have between those two countries. So talk about how we got here, because there seems to be a completely different trajectory being charted, and it's being led by Russia and China, and yet and Iran as well, and India. But many of these countries have received the ire of the West, and yet it doesn't seem to be working.
Well, I think there are two senses of the question, how did we get here? One is, how is it that the non-Western world has made so much advance in technology, military power, state organization, economic size? And the second question is, how is it that the BRICS went from a label given by an economist at Goldman Sachs, different Sachs, by the way, just to be clear, at Goldman Sachs, to a geopolitical entity? So two different points. But the first one I want to mention is that all of economic history, dating back 2,000 years plus, shows that at various points, one region of the world gains some technological advantage and is able even to conquer other major parts of the world. But the advantage that made those conquests possible are not permanent advantages, because the conquered nations learn from them, technologies diffuse, other innovations take hold, and so nobody stays on top forever. And when you look at the Western-led world, the West was not in the lead in the world. The West, meaning Western Europe in particular, was a kind of appendage of Eurasia for a long time. During the Roman Empire in Western Europe, of course, it was a very powerful unit. But if you looked at the year 1000 AD, the West was coming out of still the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, whereas in the East you had great empires and sophistication and a larger knowledge base and more philosophy and arts and other things occurring. So there was no sense in which the West was ahead. The West begins to show its role after the so-called voyages of discovery, if you want to call them that, of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, 1498 and 1492 respectively, and the beginning of European colonial footprints in other parts of the world. But still, India and China were in many, many ways technologically more sophisticated even then. When the Industrial Revolution came and the key invention of the steam engine being made into an extremely powerful, practical, versatile instrument that could be used for war, for factory production, for transport, and for countless other things, this was the decisive breakthrough to the modern economy. And it happened first in Britain and then in Western Europe and the United States. And so it was industrialization in the 19th century that was the great, great advantage of the West, the decisive advantage. And it led to European imperialism in the 19th century and growing US imperialism in the 20th century. But very broadly speaking, without going into every nook and cranny of economic history, World War I and World War II shattered many things, ideas, systems, politics, lives, but also the European imperial system, which by the end of World War II was basically on its path of coming to an end by and large. There are still colonies around, but not the big ones. India gained independence, Indonesia gained independence, and so forth in the late 1940s, and then onward with the wars of liberation of Vietnam and other places. What happened with independence was these formerly brutalized and colonized places introduced education systems, literacy, infrastructure, and said, hell, we don't want that again. We want to catch up. And this is by and large what has happened. From 1950, instead of what economists would call the age of divergence, where the rich got richer and the poor got snookered and colonized, which was roughly from 1800 to 1950. From 1950 onward, the former colonies began a catching up process. Some completely dramatic, others not quite as successful, but broadly in the same path. And China's was the most successful from 1980 to 2020, because growth was compound roughly 10% per year for 40 years. And that's more than a 30-time increase of aggregate output. And in the meantime, China moved up the technology ladder right to the forefront of global technology. This is the single biggest game changer of all, but it's part of a more general process. Now comes your question: how did the BRICS come about as a counterweight to the West? In some sense, nobody liked the Western era of dominance when they were colonized. So I think there's a lot of historical latent resentment anyway. And why not? Because the Western world was a nasty world. It was a racist world. It was a dominating world. It was a greedy world. It was an extractive world. It was a hypocritical world. All of those things absolutely apply. But there was a sense, okay, that's the world, so we don't have to be against all of that. But the United States, to summarize, got pretty obnoxious over the last 40 years. I'm not a fan of U.S. foreign policy. I think it's been utterly nasty and self-defeating. And I say nasty because it's based on wars of choice and regime change operations and sanctions, unilateral sanctions that the U.S. puts on to tell other countries what to do. It's not based on diplomacy. It's based on bossing other countries around, not necessarily its own immediate allies in the West, so-called, but in the rest. And so the U.S. foreign policy has been quite obnoxious. Dozens and dozens of regime change operations, wars of choice, nonstop, CIA-led efforts to topple regimes around the world. The more you know, and by now I know a lot, it's deeply unpleasant, and it doesn't work. It does destabilize other places, but it doesn't serve any U.S. purpose, doesn't raise my security, doesn't raise my wealth. All it did was generate $7 trillion of war costs since 2000, and that was funded basically by borrowing from the U.S. So our debt soared to reach about 100% of GDP because we had stupid wars in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Ukraine, in Afghanistan, for nothing. But the BRICS is a reaction to that too, because the United States has pursued an aggressive hegemonic policy, basically trying to hold on to its dominance, even as the underlying economic reality is something quite different now. And that's what the U.S. doesn't understand. They need to get out of their offices and understand the world. We aren't in a Western-led world anymore. We're not in a U.S.-led world anymore. But the U.S. is trying to hang on, just like France did in North Africa for a while, just like France did in Indochina for a while. But it's an absolutely losing effort. And this is what the BRICS have noted, and actually why there are 36 countries around the table today representing more than half the world population.
Including Turkey, a NATO member, which was a huge development in and of itself. And I wanted to ask you, Professor Sachs, do you believe that BRICS, given how much it's expanding, its popularity, it's even Antonio Gutierrez was there representing the United Nations, which was really a historic moment in and of itself too. Do you feel that BRICS is going to succeed in doing what many people are wondering about, which is supplanting and creating a new alternative financial architecture and structure to ultimately get away from what Chinese President Xi Jinping, what Russian President Vladimir Putin, and what many countries who are interested in joining BRICS have been talking about, which is the weaponization of the dollar and dollar dominance?
So, again, a big question. I have a general point, which is that the U.S. Has been the main hegemon in the world for the basically nearly 80 years since the end of World War II. But that period's over. I personally do not believe that China will be the new hegemon. I think we are now in a truly multipolar world. There will be a number of major powers, the United States remaining one of them, the EU, if it holds together, being one, Russia, China, India, and maybe the African Union in 20 years will look like a geostrategic leader as well. It's not impossible. So I think we're in a multipolar world. I don't think that the West is going away, or I don't think that it's going to succumb to China's dominance, because I don't think, first of all, that China wants dominance. I don't think it's possible for China to be the world hegemon in any event, not in a military sense and not in many other senses. And it's an important footnote to add that China's population today is 1.4 billion. But by the end of the century, it could well be below 1 billion, because the fertility rates are so far below replacement level that China's population has peaked and is now declining. And of course, things depend on fertility rates in future decades, but I think it's right to say that the population will decline. It will age in terms of average age or median age. And I don't see China, therefore, wanting or able or motivated or just happening to happen having to happen, that China becomes the new hegemon. The same is kind of true with the dollar. The dollar has been the hegemonic currency, not unrelated to America's political hegemony as well. It will no longer be the hegemonic currency. There will be multiple currencies. I don't think the renminbi will supplant the dollar, but it will absolutely live alongside the dollar as a major world currency. And I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon. There may be a BRICS unit of account, like the SDR is a formal unit of account. It's a basket of currencies where the units are defined by the IMF and used in IMF accounting and in some denomination of credits and so forth. And maybe the BRICS will have a similar kind of basket and accounting, and maybe it could show up even in some bonds and in some lending and so forth. But I don't think there will be a unique BRICS currency for quite a while, if ever. So what I think we're moving towards is a multi-currency system, just like we're moving towards a multipolar system. And one of the reasons that the U.S. has accelerated this is essentially the same answer I gave about the geopolitics. The U.S. government has been absolutely obnoxious in how it's misused money. It's a privilege when other countries use your money. You get to borrow very cheap, by the way, even just printing notes that they hold, because they're dealing with your currency. So you get what we call seigniorage returns. But if you suddenly go out and confiscate the bank holdings of other governments, like we did with Russia, freezing $300 billion of Russian government assets, or you do that with Venezuela, or you do that with Iran, or you do that with Afghanistan, well, there are many ways to transact. You don't have to hold dollars. And that if I were not on good terms with the USG as being a different government, I wouldn't hold dollars either.
Go fit. Follow me.